Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world most people never get to see, a world of golden carriages and diamond tiaras of palaces with 1,000 rooms, but also a world of secrets so dark they were buried for centuries. Picture this, the most powerful woman in the world, Queen Victoria herself, starting every single morning with a shot of liquid opium. A prince gambling away millions while his people starved. A king so obsessed with pleasure that he commissioned a custom-built love chair to accommodate his appetites. These aren't rumours, these aren't exaggerations. This is the hidden history of the British royal family, and tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain. So, before we dive into this story together, I need to ask you something. If you've been searching for content that goes deeper than surface-level history, that tells you the stories they don't teach in school, then you're in the right place. Take a second to hit that subscribe button. And if tonight's story keeps you on the edge of your seat, let me know with a like. And here's something I'm genuinely curious about. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in bed, lights dimmed, ready to drift off? Or maybe you're halfway across the world just starting your day. Drop a comment and let me know. I love knowing this community is global. Now get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let the world outside fade away. Tonight's story is one you won't forget. You know we're taught from childhood to admire royalty. We watch them wave from balconies, attend their weddings on television, buy commemorative plates with their faces printed in gold. They represent everything we're supposed to aspire to: dignity, grace, restraint, the stiff upper lip, the unwavering commitment to duty. But what if I told you that behind those palace walls, the British royals were just as human as the rest of us? Actually, scratch that. What if I told you they were sometimes even more broken? Because here's the thing about having unlimited power. Unlimited wealth, unlimited access to absolutely anything you could ever want. It doesn't make you happy. In fact, it often does the opposite. It isolates you. It suffocates you. And when you're trapped in a gilded cage, when every moment of your life is scheduled and scrutinized, when you can't even choose who you'll marry, well, people find ways to escape. And for the British royals, those escapes often came in the form of addictions that would shock the very subjects who bowed before them. Let me paint you a picture of what addiction looked like in royal circles. It wasn't some street corner transaction or a moment of weakness. No royal addiction was elegant. It was prescribed by the finest doctors in silk-lined offices. It came in crystal decanters and ornate pillboxes. It was delivered to palace doors by the most respectable merchants in London. And most importantly, it was absolutely everywhere. In the 1800s, you could walk into any pharmacy in Britain and buy opium without a prescription. Laudanum, that's opium dissolved in alcohol, was considered as normal as aspirin today. Doctors recommended it for everything from teething babies to menstrual cramps. The morphine that would later destroy lives, it was marketed as a miracle cure for pain, and cocaine. When it first arrived in Europe, it was considered a health tonic. Queen Victoria herself gave cocaine-laced chewing gum to a young Winston Churchill when he visited Balmoral. Just imagine that for a moment. The Queen of England offering cocaine to a future Prime Minister, and nobody batted an eye. But here's where it gets fascinating and a little heartbreaking. The royals weren't just using these substances, they were often trapped by them. Take Queen Victoria as an example. She ascended to the throne at just 18 years old. 18. Can you imagine the pressure overnight? She went from being a sheltered princess to ruling the largest empire the world had ever seen. Every decision she made affected millions of lives. Every mistake could trigger a political crisis. And she started every single morning, with a dose of laudanum to take the edge off. Now, historians argue about whether this was true addiction or just standard medical practice of the time. But think about what that means for a second. The person making decisions about wars, about colonies, about millions of subjects, she was doing it under the influence of opium every single day. And Victoria wasn't alone. Her grandson, King Edward VII, the man they called the Uncle of Europe, had a completely different addiction. Edward was addicted to pleasure in every form: food, gambling, and women. So many women. Historians estimate he had at least 50 mistresses throughout his lifetime. He ate 4 enormous meals a day. He spent so much time at the Parisian brothel Le Chabanais that they essentially reserved a suite for him. They even built him special furniture to accommodate his, shall we say, substantial figure. We're talking about a man who became so overweight that he popularized the fashion trend of leaving the bottom button of your waistcoat undone because his belly simply wouldn't fit otherwise. But the addiction that almost destroyed the monarchy, gambling, specifically the gambling habit of George IV. This man, before he became king, managed to accumulate debt that would be worth £22 million in today's money. 22 million. He gambled it away on cards, on horses, on basically anything you could bet on. And when the bills came due, he couldn't pay them. The future King of England was essentially broke. So what did Parliament do? They made him a deal. They would pay off his debts, but only if he agreed to marry Princess Caroline of Brunswick. It was a transaction, a business arrangement. Love had nothing to do with it. And you know what's tragic? The marriage was a disaster. Caroline reportedly had questionable hygiene. George was allegedly drunk during their wedding ceremony. They separated after having one daughter, and George spent the rest of his life trying to divorce her, all because of gambling debts. Now you might be wondering, why am I telling you all this? Why does it matter that royals had addictions 200 years ago? Here's why. Because these weren't just personal failures. These addictions shaped history. Queen Victoria's opium use happened while Britain was flooding China with the drug, creating millions of addicts and starting the Opium Wars that killed tens of thousands and fundamentally altered the global balance of power. Edward VI's compulsive need for pleasure and distraction meant he largely ignored the political tensions brewing in Europe, tensions that would eventually explode into World War I. George IV's gambling debts changed how Parliament controlled royal finances forever. These weren't victimless addictions. They had consequences that rippled through history. And here's what really gets me the cover-up. The royal family got incredibly good at hiding these problems. They had doctors who would prescribe whatever was needed and keep their mouths shut. They had advisors who specialized in quietly paying off debts and making scandals disappear. They had a whole system designed to protect the image of the monarchy, even when the reality behind palace walls was falling apart. There's a phrase the royals use, never complain, never explain. It means you don't air your dirty laundry in public. You maintain the facade no matter what's happening behind closed doors. And for centuries, that's exactly what they did. The public saw the pageantry, the ceremonies, the perfect portraits. They never saw the addiction. They never saw the desperation. They never saw the human beings trapped inside those crowns. But eventually cracks started to show, scandals leaked out, court records became public, and now, in our modern age of tabloids and tell-all interviews, the secrets are harder to keep. Prince Harry's confession about using cocaine and marijuana made international headlines. The stories about Princess Margaret's wild parties and alleged drug use became part of her legend. The facade is crumbling piece by piece, and maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's time we stopped pretending that royalty makes you superhuman. Maybe it's time we acknowledge that sometimes the people with the most privilege are also the most trapped. That having everything doesn't mean needing nothing. That addiction doesn't discriminate based on your title or your bloodline. Because here's what I've learned from studying these stories. Addiction is a human problem, not a class problem. It doesn't matter if you live in a palace or a studio apartment. If you're using substances to escape pain, to numb feelings, to cope with pressure you can't handle, that's addiction. And it's heartbreaking no matter who's experiencing it. But these royal stories also teach us something else. They show us the danger of unchecked power combined with unlimited access to everything. When you can have anything you want whenever you want it without consequences, that's when addiction becomes almost inevitable. The royals didn't have anyone who could say no to them. They didn't have limits. And without limits, without accountability, human beings tend to self-destruct. So as we continue this journey together through the dark history of royal addictions, I want you to keep that in mind. These aren't just scandalous stories about rich people behaving badly. They're cautionary tales about power, privilege, pressure, and the very human need to escape when life becomes too much to bear. Now, we've just scratched the surface tonight. We've set the stage. But the real stories, the ones that will make your jaw drop, are still to come. Because we're about to dive deep into the life of one particular prince who took excess to levels you literally won't believe. A man who gambled away a fortune, drank himself into oblivion, and lived so extravagantly that he nearly bankrupted the British Empire. A man who made a deal with the devil, or in his case with Parliament, trading love for money and spending the rest of his life paying the price. His name was George IV, and his story, well, let's just say it makes modern celebrity scandals look tame by comparison. George Augustus Frederick. That was his full name. Born on August 12, 1762, the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, and from the moment he took his first breath at St. James's Palace, His entire life was mapped out for him. He would be educated by the finest tutors. He would learn languages, history, etiquette. He would marry whoever Parliament decided was politically advantageous, and one day he would wear the crown. But here's the thing about George: he had other plans. Or rather, he had no plans at all except to enjoy himself. Imagine being raised by parents who are the definition of restraint and duty. George III was known for his modesty, his dedication to simple pleasures. The man lived a relatively quiet life compared to other monarchs, but his son George was the complete opposite. It was like the universe decided to create the most rebellious heir possible just to balance things out. When George turned 21 in 1783, Parliament gave him a generous allowance to set up his own household. They granted him £60,000 up front, that's roughly $7 million today, plus an annual income of £50,000. You'd think that would be enough, right? For most people, that would be a fortune beyond imagination. George burned through it in less than a year. Let me tell you how he did it. First, he moved into Carlton House on Pall Mall and immediately started renovations. Not simple upgrades, we're talking about transforming the place into something that would make Versailles jealous. Gold leaf on every surface, crystal chandeliers in every room, silk wallpaper imported from France. The furniture alone cost more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. But that was just his house. George's real passion: horses and gambling. He spent £30,000 a year, $3.5 million in modern money just on his stables, just on horses. And then he'd bet enormous sums on those horses at the races. Sometimes he won, most times he lost. And when he lost, he'd bet more the next time, convinced his luck was about to turn. You know what's fascinating? George was actually quite charming when he wanted to be. Tall, handsome in his youth, witty, cultured. He could discuss art and literature with the best minds of his era. He had excellent taste in fashion and architecture. People genuinely liked being around him until the bills came due. By the end of 1784, barely 2 years into his independence, George was £160,000 in debt. That's roughly $19 million today. 19 million in 2 years. His father refused to help him. King George III basically said, "You made this mess, you figure it out." And for a while, George actually tried. He closed up Carlton House, moved into a smaller residence on Park Street, and attempted to live more modestly. It lasted about 5 minutes. Here's where the story gets really interesting and really sad. George had fallen in love. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert, and she was everything his parents would hate. She was a widow. She was 6 years older than him, and most importantly, she was Catholic. According to British law specifically, the Act of Settlement from 1701, no heir to the throne could marry a Catholic and still become king. It was literally illegal. George didn't care. In December 1785, he married her in a secret ceremony at her home. Just imagine the romance of it, a prince giving up everything for love. Except George wasn't actually giving up anything. He kept the marriage secret because he knew it would disqualify him from the throne, and more importantly from getting any more money from Parliament or his father. So now George had a secret wife he couldn't acknowledge, debts that kept growing, and a father who was getting increasingly fed up with him. Something had to give. By 1787, George's debts had climbed to £270,000. $32 million in today's money. The prince went to Parliament and basically begged. He promised to be more responsible. He promised to cut back on expenses. He probably promised to name his firstborn after every member of Parliament if they'd just bail him out. And they did. But here's the catch. Parliament said this was the last time. They paid off his debts and gave him money to finish the work on Carlton House, but they made it clear there would be no more bailouts. George was 35 years old, and this was his final warning. Did he learn his lesson? What do you think? Within a few years, the debt started climbing again. The gambling continued. The parties got bigger. The renovations never stopped. And by 1794, George owed more than £500,000, $60 million. The man owed $60 million, and he had no way to pay it back. This is where the story turns from merely scandalous to genuinely tragic. Parliament made George an offer he couldn't refuse. They would pay off his debts one more time, but only if he agreed to marry his cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. Now, George didn't want to marry Caroline. He'd never even met her, but he was desperate. His creditors were threatening to take him to court. Some of his debts were to gambling partners who were getting increasingly impatient. He was running out of options. So in 1795, George agreed to the marriage. Maria Fitzherbert, his secret wife, the woman he'd sworn eternal love to, he basically had to publicly deny their marriage ever happened. Can you imagine the betrayal she must have felt? The wedding to Caroline was scheduled for April 8, 1795. The night before, George apparently drank himself into a state of near unconsciousness. When he first met Caroline a few days earlier, his reaction was reported to be horror. Some accounts say he immediately called for a glass of brandy. Others say he straight up asked if he could back out of the arrangement. Why? Well, historians have debated this for centuries. Some say Caroline had questionable personal hygiene. Several courtiers commented on it. Others say she just wasn't what George expected. But the truth is probably simpler. George was being forced to marry someone he didn't love, and he was doing it purely for money. That's a pretty good reason to need a drink. The wedding day itself was a disaster. Multiple witnesses reported that George was visibly drunk during the ceremony. One account says he could barely stand upright. Princess Caroline herself later said he spent their wedding night passed out on the floor. Romantic rite. They managed to conceive one child, Princess Charlotte, but after that George and Caroline separated. He went back to seeing Maria Fitzherbert on and off, plus various other mistresses. Caroline went off and did her own thing, which eventually involved some pretty scandalous behaviour that made even George look restrained by comparison. But the gambling didn't stop. The drinking got worse. And now George had discovered a new addiction, laudanum. Remember how I mentioned earlier that laudanum was basically opium dissolved in alcohol? By the early 1800s, George was using it regularly. At first, it was probably for pain. He had gout, which is incredibly painful. But laudanum does something interesting. It doesn't just kill pain. It makes everything feel softer, less urgent. It creates a warm, floating sensation that makes your problems feel very far away. For someone with George's level of stress and self-inflicted chaos, laudanum must have felt like a miracle. One sip and the creditor's letters didn't seem so threatening. The political pressures faded. The fact that your father still barely spoke to you didn't hurt quite so much. The problem is your body builds tolerance. You need more and more to get the same effect, and George had unlimited access to doctors who would prescribe whatever he wanted. In 1811, King George III suffered a mental breakdown from which he never recovered. This meant George finally got what he'd been waiting for his entire life power. He became Prince Regent, essentially king in all but name. You'd think this would be his moment to prove everyone wrong, to show he could be responsible. Instead, he threw the most expensive coronation in British history. When he officially became King George IV in 1820, he spent the modern equivalent of £22 million on the ceremony. Just the coronation. For comparison, his father's coronation cost about 1/10 of that. By this point, George was no longer the handsome young prince. Years of drinking, overeating and laudanum had taken their toll. He was morbidly obese. Some estimates put his weight at over 280 pounds, which might not sound extreme by today's standards. But remember, he was only 5'9". His waist was reportedly 50 inches around. He had gout so severe he could barely walk. He was probably addicted to laudanum, and he was slowly drinking himself to death. There's something profoundly sad about late-stage George. Here was a man who had everything: wealth, power, privilege, and he was utterly miserable. He spent his final years at Windsor Castle, rarely appearing in public, his health deteriorating rapidly. On June 26, 1830, George IV died at the age of 67. The official cause was upper gastrointestinal bleeding, but the autopsy revealed a whole catalogue of health problems: a massively enlarged heart, extensive liver damage, a large bladder tumour. His body was essentially shutting down from years of abuse. The Times newspaper, not exactly known for pulling punches, published an obituary that was devastating in its honesty. They wrote that there never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. Imagine that. The newspaper basically said nobody would miss him. But here's what I want you to think about: George II's addiction didn't just destroy him. It fundamentally changed how the British monarchy operates. After George, Parliament took much stricter control over royal finances. They implemented oversight systems, they set limits. They made sure no future heir could gamble away a fortune and then hold the crown hostage to pay off debts. George's excesses also changed public perception of the monarchy. Before him, royals were seen as almost divine beyond reproach. After him, the public realized these were just people, flawed, struggling human people, who happened to be born into incredible privilege. And maybe that's the real lesson here. George IV wasn't a monster. He was an addict. He was someone who coped with pressure and unhappiness through excess, through escape, through substances that promised relief but only delivered more pain. The fact that he wore a crown didn't make him immune to human weakness. If anything, the crown made his weaknesses more dangerous both to himself and to the institution he represented. You know what keeps me up at night thinking about George? The waste of it all. Imagine having unlimited resources, unlimited opportunity, unlimited potential to do good in the world, and throwing it all away because you can't stop chasing the next bet, the next drink, the next temporary escape from yourself. But the story doesn't end with George, because while he was gambling away fortunes and drinking himself to death, someone else was watching. Someone who would learn very different lessons from unlimited power and access to substances. Someone who would use those substances not just to escape personal pain, but to build an empire. Her name was Victoria, and her relationship with drugs would make George's addictions look almost quaint by comparison. Because Victoria didn't just use opium for herself, she turned it into the foundation of British imperial wealth, creating millions of addicts across an entire continent, all in the name of balancing trade and filling the empire's coffers. And that story, that's where things get truly dark. When Victoria was born in 1819, nobody expected her to become queen. She was fifth in line to the throne, but one by one, through death and circumstance, the people ahead of her fell away. And on June 20th, 1837, at 5 a.m, 18-year-old Alexandrina Victoria was woken up and told that her uncle King William IV had just died. She was now Queen of the British Empire, the largest empire in human history. 18 years old. Think about what you were doing at 18. Maybe college, your first job, still figuring out who you were. Now imagine being told you're responsible for ruling over a quarter of the world's population. Over 400 million people. Every decision you make could start a war crash, an economy, change the course of history. And you can't say no. You can't quit. You can't take a day off. The pressure must have been unimaginable. So what did Victoria do? She did what any sensible person in her position would do. She reached for something to take the edge off. And in 1837, that something was laudanum. Now I mentioned laudanum in passing earlier, but let me really explain what this stuff was. Laudanum was a tincture, basically opium, dissolved in alcohol, usually with some herbs and spices added to make it taste less awful. The standard formulation was about 10% opium and 90% alcohol. 1 teaspoon of laudanum contained enough opium to give you a pretty serious high. And it was available at every pharmacy in Britain. No prescription needed, no questions asked. You could buy it as easily as you buy cough syrup today. Victoria's doctors recommended it for everything. Couldn't sleep, laudanum. Menstrual cramps, laudanum. Headache, anxiety. General feelings of being overwhelmed by the weight of an empire, laudanum, laudanum, laudanum. And Victoria took their advice. According to medical records that have survived, and we're lucky to have these because royal physicians kept detailed notes, Victoria started her day with a dose of laudanum every morning, for years. Some historians argue it was medicinal, just following doctor's orders. Others point out that when you take an addictive substance every single day for years, the line between medicine and addiction gets pretty blurry. But here's what really blows my mind. Victoria's medicine cabinet was like a pharmacy. She had laudanum for pain and anxiety. She had cocaine, which was new to Europe in the 1860s and considered a miracle cure for fatigue and depression. She reportedly had cannabis tincture for menstrual cramps, which honestly seems pretty forward-thinking for the 1800s. And when she gave birth to her children, she was one of the first women to use chloroform as anesthesia. She loved it so much she called it delightful beyond measure, and insisted on using it for subsequent births, even though many doctors at the time thought it was dangerous. Think about that for a second. The Queen of England, the woman whose name defines an entire era of supposed moral strictness and propriety, she was basically running a personal pharmaceutical experiment on herself. But here's where Victoria's story gets complicated. Because she wasn't just using these substances privately, she was sharing them. When young Winston Churchill visited Balmoral Castle with his family, Victoria reportedly gave him cocaine-laced chewing gum. She was genuinely enthusiastic about it, believed it was good for you. Can you imagine? Here, young man, have some cocaine. It'll perk you right up. Now, before we judge too harshly, we need to understand something. In Victorian Britain, the line between medicine and drugs as we understand them today simply didn't exist. Opiates were in everything. Cough syrup, pain medication, even children's teething powders. Cocaine was marketed as a health tonic. Marijuana was prescribed for women's health issues. These weren't considered dangerous vices. They were modern medicine. But Victoria's relationship with these substances wasn't just personal. It was political. And this is where the story turns from interesting to genuinely disturbing. See, while Victoria was sipping her morning laudanum, the British Empire had a massive economic problem. Britain was addicted to Chinese tea. And I mean addicted in the literal sense. By the 1830s, Britain was importing enormous quantities of tea from China, and the British public couldn't get enough of it. Afternoon tea became a national institution. But here's the problem: China didn't want anything Britain had to offer in return. The Chinese had silk, they had porcelain, they had tea. What did they need from Britain? Not much. So Britain was hemorrhaging silver, paying for all this tea with precious metals and getting nothing back. The trade deficit was becoming unsustainable. The British East India Company, essentially a private corporation that functioned as a government in India, came up with a solution. A terrible, cynical, devastating solution. They would grow opium in India and sell it to China. Opium was incredibly addictive. Once you got people hooked, they'd pay anything for more. It was the perfect product from a purely economic standpoint if you had zero moral compass whatsoever. And that's exactly what they did. British India started producing massive quantities of opium and shipping it to China. At first, it was a trickle, then a flood. By the time Victoria became queen, opium was accounting for 15 to 20% of British India's entire revenue. That's not a typo. 15 to 20%. The empire was literally being funded by drug dealing. The Chinese government was horrified. They watched as millions of their citizens became opium addicts. Productivity crashed. Families were destroyed. The social fabric of Chinese society started to unravel. In 1838, the Chinese emperor appointed a man named Lin Zexu to stop the opium trade by any means necessary. Lin Zexu was a scholar, a philosopher, someone who believed in doing the right thing. He tried diplomacy first. He wrote a letter directly to Queen Victoria, and this letter, which still exists in historical archives, is heartbreaking to read. He wrote, "We have heard that in your honourable nation too the people are not permitted to smoke opium. If it is strictly forbidden in your own country, then even more so should you prohibit others from enjoying it. Why do you take what is forbidden in your own country and encourage other countries to use it? It's a fair question, right? Britain banned opium use domestically well, sort of, but was perfectly happy to flood China with it." Lin Zexu's letter pointed out this massive hypocrisy. He appealed to Victoria's sense of morality, to basic human decency. Victoria never read the letter, or if she did, she never responded. The British government dismissed it entirely. So Lin Zexu took matters into his own hands. In the spring of 1839, he intercepted a British fleet off the coast of Canton. He seized their cargo, over 20,000 chests of opium, weighing about £2.5 million in total. And then, in front of witnesses, he had it all dumped into the sea. He destroyed it. All of it. Now, from a moral standpoint, this seems pretty reasonable. He was destroying illegal drugs being smuggled into his country. But from Britain's perspective, this was theft of valuable property. The government demanded compensation. China refused. And here's where it gets dark. Victoria's government declared war on China. They called it a defense of free trade, but everyone knew what it really was: a war to protect Britain's right to sell drugs. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. British naval technology was far superior to China's. It wasn't even close to a fair fight. The British bombarded Chinese coastal cities, slaughtered tens of thousands of people, and forced China to surrender. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, was one of the most one-sided treaties in history. China had to pay Britain massive reparations for destroying the opium, if you can believe it. They had to open 5 ports to British trade, which meant more opium would flow in, and they had to hand over Hong Kong to British control. Britain held Hong Kong for the next 155 years, all because China tried to stop a drug epidemic, but it didn't end there. When China continued to resist the opium trade, Britain went to war again. The Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 was even more brutal. British and French forces burned the old summer palace in Beijing, a priceless cultural treasure destroyed forever. More ports were forced open, more opium flooded in. By the 1880s, it's estimated that somewhere between 20 and 40 million Chinese were addicted to opium. Let that number sink in. 40 million people. Also, Britain could balance its trade deficit and fund its empire. And Victoria, she continued taking her morning laudanum. She continued using cocaine. She continued presiding over an empire built in significant part on drug money. Did she feel guilty? Did she see the irony? The historical record doesn't tell us. Maybe she rationalized it. After all, she was using these substances medicinally under a doctor's care. That was different from Chinese people smoking opium in dens, wasn't it? Except it really wasn't. Addiction is addiction, whether you're a queen taking laudanum in a palace or a labourer smoking opium in a slum. The chemical dependency, the inability to function without it, the way it takes over your life, that's all the same. Here's what keeps me up at night. Victoria wasn't a monster. By most accounts, she was a devoted mother. She had 9 children, though she complained about pregnancy constantly. She was deeply attached to her husband Albert, and when he died in 1861, she mourned him for the rest of her life. She took her duties seriously. She cared about her empire in her own way. But she was also complicit in one of the largest drug trafficking operations in human history. She benefited from it. Her empire was funded by it. And she never, not once, as far as we know, questioned whether it was right. This is the paradox of Victoria. She's remembered as this prim, proper moral figure. The Victorian era is synonymous with strict social codes and sexual repression. But the woman who defined that era was personally using multiple drugs and politically profiting from creating millions of addicts. The disconnect is staggering, and maybe that's the real lesson here. Addiction and moral certainty aren't opposites. Some of history's most addicted people were also its most judgmental. They could see clearly the flaws in others, while being completely blind to their own dependencies. Victoria could condemn others for moral failings while never examining the foundations of her own empire's wealth. But Victoria's pharmaceutical adventures weren't the most scandalous addiction in the royal family, not by a long shot. Because while she was building a drug empire abroad, her son was building a different kind of empire at home. An empire of pleasure, of excess, of appetites so vast they would literally require custom-built furniture to accommodate. His name was Edward, and his addictions would make Victoria's morning laudanum look positively quaint. Albert Edward, that's what his parents called him, named after his father, was born into a suffocating world. His mother Victoria watched him constantly, terrified he'd turn out like her dissolute uncles. His father, Prince Albert, designed an education so rigorous, so demanding that young Edward barely had time to breathe. Tutors filled every hour of his day. There were no playmates his age, no freedom, no childhood really. And then in 1861, everything changed. Edward was 19 years old, stationed with the Grenadier Guards at the Curragh camp near Dublin. His fellow officers noticed something: the future King of England was a virgin. In their minds, this was unacceptable. A prince needed to be a man. So they arranged for an Irish actress named Nellie Clifton to be smuggled into his quarters one night. What happened next depends on which historian you believe, but the general consensus is that Nellie taught Edward things that transformed him. When he returned from Ireland, he was different, confident, aware of something he'd been missing his entire controlled, monitored life. He'd discovered pleasure, and he wanted more. The problem his parents found out. Prince Albert was mortified. He wrote Edward a letter calling his behaviour disgusting and warning him about the consequences to yourself, to your family, and to the country. Then Albert travelled to Cambridge in November 1861 to confront his son in person. It was cold and rainy. Albert wasn't feeling well, but he went anyway because this was too important to ignore. 2 weeks later, Prince Albert was dead. Typhoid fever officially. But Victoria blamed Edward. She believed the stress of Edward's sexual transgression had killed her beloved husband. She wore black for the rest of her life, 40 years of mourning, and every time she looked at Edward, she saw the son who had disappointed his father to death. Can you imagine living with that, your mother blaming you for your father's death? Because you had sex, the guilt would be crushing. Except Edward didn't respond with guilt. He responded by doing exactly what his father had warned him not to do. More women, more affairs, more of everything. Here's what I find fascinating. Edward wasn't sneaking around in shame. He was almost defiant about it. In 1863, 2 years after his father's death, he married Princess Alexandra of Denmark. She was beautiful, elegant, everything a princess should be, and Edward genuinely seemed to love her in his way. They had 6 children together. By many accounts, it was a happy marriage. But happiness for Edward didn't mean monogamy, not even close. Within years of his marriage, Edward had established a pattern. He had what they called the Marlborough House set, a group of wealthy, fashionable friends who shared his love of parties, racing, gambling, and extramarital affairs. These weren't sneaky hidden relationships. They were conducted semi-openly, with everyone in high society knowing exactly what was going on. Alexandra knew too. And here's the strange part, she was okay with it. Or at least she appeared to be. She welcomed several of Edward's mistresses into their home. She was polite to them at social functions. One historian described her as having reached a comfortable agreement with her husband. He could have his affairs as long as he was discreet and always came home eventually. But let's talk about the women themselves, because their stories matter too. Lily Langtry was Edward's first major mistress. She was called the Jersey Lily because she was born on the Isle of Jersey, and when she arrived in London, society in the 1870s, she caused a sensation. She wasn't nobility, she was the daughter of a clergyman, but she was stunning. Artists wanted to paint her. Society wanted to know her. And Edward became completely infatuated. Their affair lasted about 3 years, from 1877 to 1880. Edward was so besotted that he basically launched her career as an actress, using his influence to get her roles and ensure good reviews. But the affair ended badly. Lily became pregnant, probably not by Edward, historians think, but by one of her other lovers. Edward couldn't be associated with that kind of scandal, so he distanced himself. Suddenly, the prince who had showered her with attention and gifts was nowhere to be found. Lily was left to face society's judgment alone, and here's the unfair part, she was ostracized, gossiped about, her reputation destroyed. Edward. He just moved on to the next woman. That's privilege in action right there. The consequences of these affairs were never equally distributed. Next came Daisy Brooke, later known as Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick. Her affair with Edward lasted 9 years, much longer than most. Daisy was married to a wealthy aristocrat, and she was known for being vivacious, opinionated, and indiscreet. They called her Babbling Brooke, because she couldn't keep a secret to save her life. Daisy did something interesting, though. After her affair with Edward ended, she became a socialist. She started writing about inequality, about the plight of the poor, about how wrong it was that people like her lived in luxury while others starved. Some historians think her time with Edward, seeing that level of excess up close, radicalized her. She spent her later years founding charities and advocating for social reform. It's like she looked at that glittering world of affairs and parties and said, "This is actually kind of disgusting." But the scandal that almost destroyed Edward happened in 1869, and it didn't involve one of his mistresses, it involved the husband of one. Sir Charles Mordaunt was a member of Parliament, and he suspected his wife, Lady Harriet Mordaunt, was having an affair. When their child was born with what might have been a hereditary eye disease, Lady Harriet apparently had a breakdown and confessed to adultery with several men, including the Prince of Wales. Sir Charles sued for divorce and named Edward as a co-respondent. This meant Edward would have to testify in court. The heir to the British throne sitting in a witness box answering questions about whether he'd slept with another man's wife. It was unprecedented. It was humiliating. Victoria was beside herself with anger and embarrassment. In February 1870, Edward appeared in court. The newspapers went wild. Thousands of people tried to get into the courtroom to watch. Edward testified under oath that while he had visited Lady Mordaunt and written her letters, their relationship had been entirely innocent. The judge believed him, or at least chose to believe him, and Edward was cleared of adultery. But his reputation took a massive hit. When he appeared at the theatre shortly after he was booed, people shouted insults. For the first time, Edward faced real public consequences for his behaviour. Did it change him? Not really. He just got better at hiding things. Now we need to talk about Paris, because if London was where Edward maintained appearances, Paris was where he let loose completely. He visited Paris regularly, sometimes for weeks at a time, and his favourite destination was a brothel called Le Chabanais, located on Rue Chabanais in the 2nd arrondissement. Le Chabanais wasn't just any brothel. It was the most luxurious, most expensive, most exclusive establishment in Paris. It had themed rooms, a medieval room, an Indian room, a Japanese room. The women working there were considered the most beautiful and sophisticated in the city, and Edward was such a regular customer that they gave him his own room. Here's where the story gets wild. By the 1890s, Edward had gained a significant amount of weight. By some estimates, he was close to 300 pounds. This created logistical challenges for his romantic activities. So Edward commissioned a piece of custom furniture from a French cabinet maker named Louis Soubrier. This furniture, which still exists by the way in a museum, is often called a love chair, but it's more complicated than that. It's basically a specialized seat with supports and stirrups, designed to make certain activities easier for someone of Edward's size. The craftsmanship is actually impressive. It's covered in fine leather and fabric carefully engineered, and it tells you something about Edward that he was willing to have this built to commission artisans to help facilitate his sexual activities. Some historians argue this shows sex addiction. Others say it was just the libertine culture of the time that lots of wealthy men visited brothels, and Edward was simply more visible because he was royal. But I think there's a difference between occasional visits and having custom furniture built. That suggests something more compulsive. But Edward's compulsions weren't limited to sex. Remember, he also gambled heavily, and in 1890 gambling got him into serious trouble at a house party at Tranby Croft in Yorkshire. Edward and several friends were playing baccarat, an illegal card game in Britain at the time. One of the players, a lieutenant colonel named Sir William Gordon Cumming, was accused of cheating. Now, among gentlemen of that era, there was a code you didn't cheat, and if you were caught, you quietly accepted the consequences. Gordon Cumming was forced to sign a document promising never to play cards again. But Gordon Cumming didn't stay quiet. He sued for slander, claiming he'd been falsely accused. This meant Edward would have to testify again, not about sex this time, but about illegal gambling. The Prince of Wales admitting in court that he regularly played an illegal card game. The scandal was enormous. During the trial, details emerged about how much Edward gambled and how often. The public was shocked. Here was the future king breaking the law, betting enormous sums while claiming he lived a respectable life. Edward was questioned about why he even carried gambling counters with him. His answer, "I always carry them because I like to play baccarat wherever I go." The case damaged Edward's reputation again, but by this point he was in his 50s. He was who he was. His patterns were set. The affairs continued. The gambling continued. The parties, the food, the excess, all of it continued. What drove him? That's the question that fascinates me. Edward had everything: wealth, status, a wife who loved him, children, public adoration. Why wasn't it enough? I think the answer goes back to his childhood. Edward grew up under constant surveillance, constant criticism, constant pressure to be perfect. His father's death and his mother's blame created a wound that never healed. So he spent his adult life seeking pleasure, seeking validation, seeking anything that would make him feel good in the moment. It's textbook addiction behavior, using something external, whether it's a substance or an activity or a person, to fill an internal void. And it took a toll. By his 50s, Edward was struggling with his health. The obesity made it hard to walk. He had gout. He was short of breath. His doctors warned him to slow down, to lose weight, to stop smoking cigars and eating massive meals. He ignored them. But there was one woman who stayed with him until the end. Alice Keppel entered Edward's life in 1898 when he was 56 and she was 29. Unlike many of his previous mistresses, Alice was discreet, intelligent, and politically astute. She could smooth Edward's famous temper tantrums. She could navigate the complex social situations at court. Alexandra actually preferred Alice to previous mistresses because at least Alice knew how to behave properly. When Edward became king in 1901, Alice effectively became a shadow queen. She advised him on political matters. She hosted gatherings at her home that were essential to London society. She was compensated not with direct payments that would be too scandalous, but with shares in rubber companies and other investments that made her wealthy. Edward's bankers managed her money. He secured good jobs for her husband. It was an entire system designed to keep his mistress living in royal-adjacent luxury. And when Edward lay dying in May 1910, it was Alice he wanted there. Alexandra allowed her to visit the dying king. She sat by his bedside, but at some point Alexandra's patience ran out. According to witnesses, she told the doctors to get that woman out of here. Alice was escorted from the room sobbing. Edward's final words were about horse racing. His son, the future King George V, told him one of his horses had won at Kempton Park. Edward smiled and said, "I am very glad." Then he slipped into unconsciousness and died. He was 68 years old. His autopsy revealed the damage and enlarged heart are diseased liver tumours. His body had finally given out after decades of excess. The newspapers were surprisingly harsh. The Times wrote that Edward's death was not unforeseen given his lifestyle. Others were more direct. He had eaten, drunk, smoked, and pleasured himself to death. But here's what's strange. Despite everything, the scandals, the affairs, the gambling, the excess, Edward was genuinely mourned by many. He had been good at his job as king in his way. He was charming in public. He had helped ease tensions between Britain and France through diplomatic visits. People liked him even knowing about his flaws. Maybe that's because Edward's addictions were somehow more relatable than his mother's or grandfather's. Sex and food and gambling, these are things everyone understands, even if most people don't take them to such extremes. It's easier to comprehend than a queen building an opium empire or a prince gambling away millions in debts. But make no mistake, Edward was addicted. He couldn't stop. He didn't want to stop. And ultimately it killed him. His appetites consumed him in every sense of the word. Yet Edward's story, dramatic as it is, represents just one type of royal addiction, the obvious visible kind. The kind that ended up in newspapers and courtrooms. But there was another type of addiction weaving through the palace halls, one that was quieter, more insidious, more socially acceptable, and possibly even more dangerous. Because everyone from doctors to society, mothers to the royal family themselves, considered it perfectly normal. This was the age of laudanum, and its grip on the British upper classes was absolute. Picture walking into a pharmacy in Victorian London. The year is 1850. Behind the polished counter, rows of glass bottles catch the light. Each one has a handwritten label in elegant script. You approach the pharmacist, a respectable man, in a clean white coat, and you tell him you haven't been sleeping well. Or maybe your child is teething and crying all night, or perhaps you've got rheumatism that makes your joints ache. Without asking any questions, without requesting any kind of proof or prescription, the pharmacist reaches for a brown bottle. "Laudanum," he says with a reassuring smile. 2 shillings for this bottle, 20 drops in water before bed. You'll sleep like a baby. And you would. You absolutely would sleep like a baby. Because that bottle contained enough opium to knock out a grown adult, and it was marketed as safe for everyone from newborns to the elderly. This was the laudanum age, and it didn't just affect royals, it saturated every level of British society. The difference was when a duchess became addicted, it was called a nervous condition that required continued medical care. When a factory worker became addicted, it was called moral weakness and depravity. Same drug, same addiction, completely different narratives. Let me tell you about some names you might recognise, people who weren't royal, but whose laudanum shaped Victorian culture in profound ways. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, one of Britain's greatest poets, started taking opium in 1791 for what he called rheumatic pain. He was 19 years old. For the next 43 years until his death in 1834, he was dependent on it. Sometimes he took it as pills, sometimes as laudanum, but he took it every single day. His poetry, including Kubla Khan and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, was reportedly written while under the influence. Coleridge was honest about his struggle in his private letters. He called it his cursed slavery. He wrote about the shame, the way he tried to stop but couldn't, the way he'd promise himself just one more dose and then break that promise hours later. Does that sound familiar? That's the voice of addiction speaking across 2 centuries. And here's the heartbreaking part. Coleridge's daughter, Sarah Coleridge, also became dependent on laudanum. She confided to friends that she couldn't sleep without it. The addiction passed from parent to child, not through genetics alone, but through normalization. If your father took laudanum daily, if the family doctor prescribed it freely, how would you know it was dangerous? Thomas de Quincey went even further. In 1821, he published Confessions of an English Opium Eater, a book that described his addiction in vivid, sometimes beautiful prose. He wrote about the divine pleasures of opium, the way it made music sound more profound, colours, more vibrant thoughts, more clear. But he also described the nightmares, the withdrawal symptoms, the way his life had become organised entirely around securing and taking his next dose. The book was a sensation. Everyone read it. But here's what's wild. It didn't scare people away from opium. If anything, it made some people curious. De Quincey made addiction sound almost romantic, like a journey into consciousness. He portrayed himself as a tortured genius, and readers ate it up. George Eliot, who wrote Middlemarch and other classics, included opium use in several of her novels. In Silas Marner, there's a character named Molly Farron who's addicted to opium and Elliot doesn't romanticize it. She shows Molly as desperate, degraded, ultimately destroyed by her addiction. It's one of the more honest portrayals in Victorian literature. Wilkie Collins, who wrote The Moonstone, took laudanum for gout starting in the 1860s. He took massive doses. Some accounts say he was consuming quantities that should have killed him. He experienced hallucinations, including a recurring vision of a woman with green skin who followed him around. He called her his ghost woman. That's how much laudanum he's taking, enough to make him see things that weren't there. And he kept writing. Some of his best work was produced while he was, by any reasonable standard, completely out of his mind on opiates. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the famous poet, took laudanum for a spinal injury. Lord Byron experimented with it. Percy Shelley took it. John Keats took it. These weren't fringe figures. These were the literary giants of the era, the people who defined Victorian culture, and they were all dosing themselves with opium. But it wasn't just the famous who had access. Laudanum was everywhere, and it was cheap. For a single penny, you could buy enough laudanum to get high. This made it accessible to the working poor, which created what Victorian society saw as a moral crisis. In industrial towns, particularly in the fenlands of East Anglia, where agricultural workers lived in damp, miserable conditions, laudanum use was epidemic. Women gave it to their children to keep them quiet while they worked in the fields. Factory workers took it to dull the pain of 12-hour shifts. The elderly took it because their bodies ached, and there was no other relief available. There was even a product called Godfrey's Cordial, marketed specifically for babies and children. The label said it would soothe teething pain, calm fussy babies, help children sleep. What it didn't say in large print was that it contained opium. Lots of opium. Parents would give this to their infants and the babies would sleep for hours completely still, barely breathing. Some of them never woke up. In 1843, there was a coroner's inquest in Coventry after several infant deaths. The investigation revealed that Godfrey's Cordial and similar opium-based soothing syrups were likely responsible. The coroner was horrified, but the products stayed on the market for decades because they were profitable and because nobody in power wanted to admit that respectable Britain had been accidentally poisoning its children. Think about that for a second. Victorian Britain, with all its moral certainty and its lectures about proper behaviour, was systematically drugging its own babies into unconsciousness. And when some of those babies died, society largely shrugged and kept buying the product. Now here's where class really mattered. When middle and upper class people, especially women, became dependent on laudanum, it was medicalised. Doctors would prescribe it for hysteria or neurasthenia, or any number of vague conditions that basically meant being a woman in Victorian society is stressful. These women weren't addicts. Oh no, they had delicate constitutions that required ongoing pharmaceutical support. They'd take their laudanum in private drawing rooms from crystal decanters measured in silver spoons. Their doctors would visit regularly, adjust dosages, provide expensive treatments. Nobody called them drug addicts. They were merely unwell. Refined ladies with nervous dispositions. But when working-class people became dependent, it was called vice, moral failure, evidence of their inferior nature, the exact same chemical dependency, the exact same withdrawal symptoms, the exact same desperation, but if you were poor, you were weak. If you were rich, you were sensitive. The royal family was obviously in the latter category. We know Victoria took laudanum regularly, but she wasn't alone in the palace. Court physicians' records, those that survived, show that laudanum was prescribed freely to various members of the royal household. Ladies-in-waiting took it for headaches. Courtiers took it for anxiety before important events. It was as common as aspirin is today. And here's something most people don't know. Parts of the royal palaces had what were essentially withdrawal rooms. These were quiet chambers, usually in less trafficked areas where someone could retreat when they were experiencing the effects of opium withdrawal, the sweating, the shaking, the nausea. The official story was these were recovery rooms for people with minor illnesses, but we know better now. They were places to suffer privately away from prying eyes until you could take your next dose and feel normal again. The medical establishment was completely complicit in all of this. Doctors in the 1800s received little training about addiction. They didn't understand dependence the way we do now. Many of them thought that as long as the opium was prescribed for a legitimate medical condition, addiction wasn't possible. They genuinely believed there was a difference between taking laudanum for pain versus taking it for pleasure. But your body doesn't know the difference. Your brain doesn't care why you're taking the drug. The chemical process is the same. Opiates bind to receptors in your brain, flood you with feel-good chemicals, and then your brain adapts by producing less of those chemicals naturally. Eventually you need the drug just to feel normal. That's addiction, whether you're taking it for gout or grief, or just to get through the day. The advertising of the time is jaw-dropping to modern eyes. There were ads in newspapers for Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, full of morphine showing peaceful babies and grateful mothers. Ads for Ayer's cherry pectoral, loaded with opium promising to cure coughs, colds and consumption. One ad for laudanum itself used the tagline, "A friend to man when all else fails." And technically, that wasn't even false advertising. Laudanum was a friend right until it wasn't. Right until you realized you couldn't stop taking it. Right until you understood that this friend now controlled your entire life. The turning point started slowly. A few doctors began publishing papers about opiate dependence in the 1860s and 70s. They documented withdrawal symptoms. They tracked patients who couldn't stop using even when their original pain had healed. They began to understand that this was a medical problem, not a moral failing. In 1868, Britain passed the Pharmacy Act. For the first time, it required that opium and laudanum could only be sold by registered pharmacists. The bottles had to be labelled. Children under 16 couldn't buy it. It wasn't much you could still walk into any pharmacy and buy it without a prescription, but it was a start. By the 1880s and 90s, there was a growing anti-opium movement. Religious groups, particularly the Quakers, campaigned against the opium trade both domestically and abroad. They published pamphlets describing the devastation of addiction. They organised protests. They lobbied Parliament. But change came slowly, because too many powerful people had too much to lose. The opium trade funded a significant chunk of British India's revenue. Pharmaceutical companies made enormous profits from opium-based medicines. Doctors were reluctant to admit they'd been prescribing addictive substances for decades. And patients, many of them wealthy, respectable patients, didn't want to admit they were dependent on a drug. By the early 1900s, aspirin and other new pain medications started replacing laudanum. Doctors finally had alternatives to offer. But the damage was done. Generations of British people, from royals to factory workers, had been exposed to opiates. Some had become addicted. Some had died. All of them had lived through a period when society's most addictive substance was as available as cough syrup. What haunts me about the laudanum age is how normal it all seemed at the time. Nobody was trying to create an epidemic. The doctors genuinely thought they were helping. The parents giving laudanum to their babies genuinely thought they were soothing their children's pain. The society ladies taking it for their nerves genuinely thought it was medicine, not addiction. But intentions don't matter when the chemical is this powerful. Good intentions don't prevent dependence, and respectability doesn't make addiction any less real. The laudanum age teaches us something crucial. Addiction doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's shaped by the society around it, by what's available, by what's considered acceptable, by who has access and who doesn't. The royals, with their morning laudanum ritual, weren't that different from the factory worker drinking it to get through a shift. They were all caught in the same chemical trap, they just had very different resources for hiding it. But laudanum was just one chapter in the long story of royal addiction. Before the Victorian era, before the British Empire reached its peak, there were other royals with other addictions that shaped history in equally profound ways. Gambling that lost kingdoms, gluttony that became legendary, behaved so excessive they laid the groundwork for everything that came after. To understand how the British royals developed such a complicated relationship with addiction, we need to go back further. Back to the Tudor and Georgian courts, where the patterns first emerged, where appetite first became policy and excess first became tradition. Long before Victoria's morning laudanum or George IV's gambling debts, there was a king who set the template for royal excess. A king so legendary that even now, 500 years later, everyone knows his name. He married 6 times. He broke with the Catholic Church. He transformed England forever. And he had appetites that were absolutely insatiable. Henry VIII didn't just change history through his marriages and his politics, he changed it through his addictions. Born in 1491, Henry became king at 17, young, athletic, handsome. Contemporary accounts describe him as over 6 feet tall, which was giant for that era, with a powerful build from years of jousting and hunting. He could apparently tire out multiple horses in a single day. He was energetic, charismatic, the kind of prince that fairy tales are written about. But Henry had a problem that would grow throughout his reign. He couldn't control his appetites. Any of them. Let's start with gambling, because that's where it began. Henry loved games of chance. cards, dice, betting on jousts, wagering on tennis matches if you could put money on it. Henry did, and he didn't bet small amounts. Royal account books from his reign show gambling losses that were staggering even by modern standards. In one particularly bad week in 1520, Henry lost the equivalent of about £400,000 in today's money. In 7 days, at dice. His treasurer was reportedly panicking, trying to figure out how to cover the debt without raising taxes again. Henry just shrugged and said something like, "We'll win it back next week." He rarely did. But here's what makes Henry's gambling different from George III's. Henry was the king. He wasn't waiting for Parliament to bail him out. He could just take more money, raise taxes, confiscate property from nobles who'd fallen out of favour, dissolve monasteries and seize their wealth, which, by the way, he did, and while historians cite religious and political reasons for the dissolution of the monasteries, the fact that it made Henry incredibly wealthy probably didn't hurt his decision-making. Henry's most famous gambling moment came in 1520 at an event called the Field of Cloth of Gold. This was a meeting between Henry and King Francis III of France, supposedly, to broker peace between their countries. But really, it was a competition to see who could throw the most lavish, most expensive, most over-top party in history. Henry brought his entire court to France. They erected a temporary palace, a palace mind you not tents covered in cloth of gold, which is fabric literally woven with gold thread. There were fountains flowing with wine, elaborate tournaments, feasts that lasted for hours, and of course gambling. Henry and Francis bet enormous sums on wrestling matches, archery contests and various games. The whole thing cost England's treasury an amount that some historians estimate would be over £20 million today, for a party that lasted 3 weeks and accomplished basically nothing politically because Henry and Francis ended up going to war anyway a couple of years later. But gambling wasn't Henry's only addiction. There was also food. Have you ever seen the portraits of young Henry versus old Henry? It's shocking. Young Henry is slim, athletic, vigorous. Old Henry is massive. By his 50s, Henry's waist measured 54 inches around. He had to be lifted onto his horse by mechanical devices. He had ulcers on his legs that wouldn't heal, probably because of his weight and poor circulation. He was in constant pain, and he kept eating. Royal banquets under Henry were legendary. We have menus from some of these feasts, actual written records of what was served. A typical dinner might include whole roasted swans, peacocks sometimes sewn back into their feathers, after cooking for presentation. Entire deer, dozens of different meat pies, elaborate sugar sculptures, and course after course after course of food. One feast served over 30 different dishes just for the first course. Henry would eat for hours, literally hours. He'd start in early afternoon and still be eating at midnight. And these weren't small portions, we're talking about platters of meat, whole birds, massive amounts of food that would feed a modern family for weeks. Why, some historians argue it was about displaying wealth and power. If you could afford to serve peacock and swan, you were showing everyone how rich you were. But there's a point where conspicuous consumption becomes compulsion. Henry wasn't just eating to impress people. He was eating because he couldn't stop. One of his physicians, Thomas Vicary, wrote about treating Henry's various ailments. The leg ulcers, the obesity, the mobility problems. He never uses the word addiction, because that concept didn't really exist yet, but he describes a patient who couldn't moderate his consumption despite clear health consequences. That's addiction by any modern definition. And here's where it gets sad. Henry's weight probably contributed to his inability to produce a male heir who survived to adulthood. His health was declining rapidly by his 40s. His weight made him less fertile. His constant pain made him irritable and paranoid, which might explain some of his more brutal decisions in later years, including beheading 2 of his wives. The appetites that started as youthful enthusiasm became compulsions that shaped policy-destroyed lives and changed the course of English history. If Henry had been able to control his eating, his gambling, his various obsessions, would England's history be different? We'll never know. But it's worth considering. Now fast forward about 200 years to the Georgian era. If you thought Henry's gambling was bad, the Georgian aristocracy took it to an entirely new level. The period from roughly 1714 to 1830, covering the reigns of the fourth King George, saw gambling become so endemic among the British upper classes that it threatened the stability of the entire social order. We're not talking about friendly card games for small stakes. We're talking about men losing their entire fortunes, their estates, everything they owned in a single night. Here's a story that's almost too bizarre to believe, but it's documented in multiple historical sources. In 1719, the Duke of Richmond had massive gambling debts he couldn't pay. So what did he do? He married off his 18-year-old son to the 13-year-old daughter of the Earl of Cadogan. Immediately. As payment for the debts, read that again, a man literally sold his teenage son in marriage to pay off gambling debts. The boy and girl were married, and then the boy was sent away and didn't see his wife again until she was 16. Can you imagine being that girl, 13 years old, married to a stranger, all because your father-in-law couldn't stop betting on cards? And this wasn't some isolated incident. Throughout the Georgian period, estates changed hands over gambling debts. Ancient family homes were lost at the baccarat table. Fortunes built over generations were wiped out in an evening. There was a game called Pharaoh that was particularly destructive. It was a simple game, basically betting on which cards would be dealt, but the odds slightly favoured the house, which meant if you played long enough you'd lose. And Georgian aristocrats played for hours, days sometimes. There are accounts of games at exclusive clubs that went on for 48 hours straight, with fortunes changing hands repeatedly. The most famous gambling establishment was White's Club in London, founded in 1693. It still exists, by the way. It's the oldest gentlemen's club in London. But in the 1700s, White's was notorious. The betting book at White's recorded some absolutely insane wagers. Men bet on which raindrop would reach the bottom of a window first. They bet on when a particular elderly member would die. They bet on anything and everything. One infamous bet involved two aristocrats wagering on whether a man who'd collapsed on the street outside the club was dead or merely unconscious. When someone suggested they should help him, the gamblers protested helping might affect the outcome of the bet. That's how deep the addiction ran. A man's life was less important than settling a wager. Charles James Fox, who we met earlier as George Thut's friend, lost everything gambling, multiple times. His father had to buy back his estates repeatedly. By some estimates, his lifetime gambling losses would be equivalent to £7 million today. And Fox wasn't unusual. He was just more visible because he was a prominent politician. The Scottish estates were hit particularly hard. The Laird of Glenlyon, Robert Campbell, gambled away his entire property in the late 1600s. He'd already spent a fortune renovating his castle and needed money to pay those debts, so he gambled lost and had to sell everything, including ancient forests that had been in his family for generations. He sold trees from the Great Caledonian Forest, and in the rush to harvest them, they caused massive flooding that destroyed even more of his property. Gambling destroyed him completely. James Douglas, the second Marquis of Douglas, lost so much gambling that he had to sell Tantallon Castle and other properties at the end of the 17th century. In 1820, Lord Napier sold Kilmahue Castle to pay gambling debts. During the Highland clearances, when tenant farmers were forcibly removed from their lands, one of the motivations for some landowners was servicing gambling debts. They needed cash, so they cleared their land of people and rented it to sheep farmers instead. Let that sink in for a moment. Entire communities where displaced families that had lived on the same land for generations were forced to emigrate, all because wealthy men couldn't stop gambling. Now you might wonder, where were the authorities in all this? Why didn't someone step in? The answer is complicated. Gambling was technically illegal in Britain for much of this period, but the laws were rarely enforced against the aristocracy. It was fine to prosecute working-class people for running illegal dice games in the streets, but when nobles were losing estates at White's Well, that was just gentlemen being gentlemen. There was also a cultural element. In Georgian society, being a man of the world meant being comfortable with risk. A gentleman was expected to bet on horses, play cards, take chances. Being too cautious with money was seen as cowardly almost. The culture actively encouraged gambling as a mark of sophistication. But there was one king during this era who seemed to escape the gambling addiction, George III. Remember him, George IV's father, the one who disapproved of his son's excesses. George III was known for his relatively modest lifestyle. He didn't gamble heavily. He didn't throw lavish parties. He lived fairly simply for a king. But George III had his own struggles with addiction, though his came in the form of medical treatments that probably did more harm than good. George III is famous for his madness. He had several episodes of mental illness throughout his life, including the one in 1811 that led to his son becoming Prince Regent. For years, historians thought he was simply going insane. But in the 1960s, researchers proposed that George actually suffered from porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can cause symptoms that look like mental illness. The treatments George received for his illness were intense. He was subjected to what was called the treatment of the insane, which involved restraint, isolation, blistering agents applied to his skin to draw out the madness, and massive doses of various medications. One of those medications was probably opium, another was antimony, a toxic metal. He was given emetics to make him vomit, purgatives to make him... well, you get the idea. George's doctors were trying to help, but they were essentially poisoning him. And because he was king, because they had to be seen to be doing something, they kept giving him these treatments, even when they clearly weren't working. We don't know if George became dependent on any of these medications, but consider this: he was given opium regularly for pain and to calm him during his episodes. Over time, his body would have built tolerance. His symptoms during clear periods might have been partly withdrawal, and the doctors, not understanding addiction, would have given him more opium to treat those symptoms, creating a cycle. George III's story shows us that addiction doesn't always look like deliberate excess. Sometimes it looks like treatment. Sometimes the most dangerous substances are the ones prescribed with the best intentions. Now, I've been talking a lot about gambling and medication, but there's another addiction that ran through the royal family for generations: food. We touched on Henry VIII, but he wasn't alone. Throughout royal history, elaborate feasting was how you displayed power. Medieval and early modern royal banquets weren't just meals, they were performances. Dishes were presented in order of importance. The number of courses reflected your status. The rarity and expense of the ingredients showed your wealth. But again, there's a line between displaying power and being controlled by appetite. Many royals crossed that line. George Thor, who we discussed earlier, ate 4 enormous meals a day, even when he was so obese he could barely move. His breakfast alone was massive. Think full English breakfast multiplied by 5, then lunch, then tea with pastries, then a dinner that lasted hours. His doctors begged him to eat less. He couldn't. Food addiction is tricky because you can't just quit eating the way you can quit gambling or drinking. You need food to live. But when eating becomes compulsive, when you're consuming far more than your body needs despite obvious health consequences, when food is your primary source of comfort or pleasure, that's addiction. And for royals, food was always available. No one was going to tell the king he couldn't have another helping. The palace kitchens existed to fulfill any culinary whim. Want a feast at midnight done? Want exotic foods shipped from across the empire? No problem. Want to eat until you're sick and then eat more? Well, your majesty, if that's what you wish. The health consequences were brutal. Gout was endemic among royals. That's a condition where uric acid crystals form in your joints, causing excruciating pain. It's directly related to diet, particularly eating lots of red meat and drinking lots of alcohol. Henry VI had it. George V had it. Lots of Georgian aristocrats had it. They called it the disease of kings because it was so common among the wealthy. Obesity, heart disease, shortened lifespans, these were the price of unlimited access to food combined with no physical labour. And yet generation after generation continued the same patterns. Why? Because these weren't just personal choices. They were cultural expectations. Royal excess was tradition. It was how you proved you were royal. And breaking those traditions, admitting that maybe the old ways were harmful, questioning whether monarchs should behave differently, that was almost unthinkable, until women started questioning it. Because while male royals could be public about their excesses, could gamble at clubs, feast at banquets, generally do whatever they wanted, female royals had to be more careful. Their addictions had to be hidden, managed, treated as medical conditions rather than moral failings. And in that difference, in that gap between how male and female royal addiction was perceived and handled, lies a whole other story of pain, pressure, and substances used to cope with impossible expectations. There's a photograph from 1965 that tells you everything about Princess Margaret. She's at a party, one of many parties, cigarette in one hand, drink in the other, eyes half closed in that way that suggests she's already several drinks past caring. She's 35 years old, beautiful, fashionable, the sister of the Queen, and she looks exhausted, not physically tired, soul tired. Margaret Rose was born in 1930, the younger daughter of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. She was never supposed to be particularly important in royal terms. Her older sister Elizabeth would be queen. Margaret could just be herself, or so everyone thought. But being just herself turned out to be impossible, because Margaret was royal enough to be trapped by all the rules, but not royal enough to have any real power. She couldn't marry who she wanted. She couldn't pursue the career she might have chosen. She couldn't escape the constant scrutiny. All she could do was show up, smile, wave, and somehow find a way to cope with being perpetually secondary. So she turned to things that made her feel good, or at least things that made her feel less trapped. Let's talk about what we know for certain. Margaret smoked heavily from her teenage years onward. Not just a few cigarettes, we're talking 60 cigarettes a day at her peak. 60? Her fingers were stained yellow. Her voice became that distinctive gravelly rasp. When she developed health problems in her 60s, her doctors told her the smoking had destroyed her lungs. She kept smoking anyway. She drank. A lot. Her preferred drink was a combination of vodka and whiskey called a mama or a pupper, depending on the proportions. She'd start drinking in the afternoon and continue well into the night. At parties, staff members learned to water down her drinks without her noticing, because otherwise she'd become embarrassingly intoxicated. But it's the harder substances where the story gets controversial. In 2002, Noel Botham published a biography of Margaret that included a startling allegation. In 1967, Margaret snorted cocaine in a dressing room before attending a Rolling Stones concert. According to Botham's sources, this wasn't an isolated incident. Margaret supposedly experimented with cocaine multiple times during the 1960s and 70s, when she was part of London's glamorous party scene. Now we need to be careful here. This allegation has never been definitively proven. The royal family never confirmed it, and Margaret died in 2002 without ever publicly addressing it. But multiple people who knew her have suggested, sometimes directly and sometimes through careful implication, that Margaret's substance use went beyond alcohol and cigarettes. What we do know for certain, because it's documented in medical records that were later released, is that in 1974 Margaret took a massive overdose of sedatives. It happened after she'd been fighting with her husband, Lord Snowdon. Their marriage was falling apart. He was having affairs. She was having affairs. They were making each other miserable but couldn't get divorced because, well, royals didn't get divorced. This was before divorce became more accepted in the family. On this particular night, Margaret called a close friend in the early hours of the morning and threatened to jump out her window if he didn't come to see her. The friend, panicking, called Queen Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's response, she told him to continue with his business because Margaret's bedroom was on the ground floor. She'd hardly be in danger. Let that sink in for a moment. Margaret was clearly in crisis, threatening self-harm, and her sister's reaction was basically, she's being dramatic, ignore her. Whether Margaret actually tried to hurt herself that night, or was just desperate for attention, and honestly, desperately crying out for attention, is its own kind of crisis. She ended up taking a dangerous amount of sleeping pills. She survived, but the incident showed how deeply unhappy she was, and how her family's response was essentially to minimise and dismiss her pain. The Queen's attitude reflected something broader. The royal family's approach to mental health and addiction was, to put it mildly, not great. There was a phrase used in palace circles: if you're cold, put on a sweater. It meant handle your own problems. Don't complain, don't make a fuss, tough it out. This worked great if your problem was being slightly chilly. It worked terribly if your problem was depression, addiction, or suicidal ideation. For Margaret, being told to essentially put on a sweater when she was drowning in unhappiness meant she self-medicated. She found her own solutions in bottles and pills and allegedly white powder. And because she was female royalty, because women weren't supposed to have these problems, because admitting she was struggling would be unbecoming, she suffered largely in private while maintaining a public persona of glamorous rebelliousness. But Margaret wasn't the first female royal to struggle with substances. Let's go back further. We've talked about Victoria using laudanum, but let's discuss the specific context of why she used certain substances. Victoria gave birth 9 times, 9 pregnancies in 17 years, and she hated it. Her private letters and diaries, the ones that survived, show that she found pregnancy disgusting and childbirth terrifying. So when chloroform became available as an anaesthetic in the 1840s, Victoria jumped at the chance to use it during labour. In 1853, when she gave birth to her 8th child, Prince Leopold, her doctor John Snow administered chloroform to her. This was controversial. Many people, including other doctors, thought it was dangerous and inappropriate. Some religious leaders even argued that women were supposed to suffer during childbirth as punishment for Eve's sin. Yeah, that was actually an argument people made. Victoria didn't care. She used chloroform and afterward called it delightful beyond measure. She used it again for her 9th child in 1857 and advocated for its use publicly. Because Victoria was queen, her endorsement of chloroform legitimised it, and soon other wealthy women were requesting it for their own deliveries. Now, chloroform used properly in medical settings isn't addiction, it's anesthesia. But here's the thing, once Victoria had experienced relief from pain through a substance, she was more open to using other substances for other discomforts. The laudanum for daily stress, the cannabis tincture for menstrual cramps, the cocaine for energy. It established a pattern: when life is difficult, when your body hurts, when your mind won't settle, reach for something chemical to fix it. And for royal women, life was often difficult in ways that men didn't experience. You couldn't control who you married, that was decided by politics and dynasty. You were expected to produce heirs, preferably male, and if you failed, you were blamed. Even though we now know it's the father's genetics that determine the baby's sex. You had almost no power, but all the scrutiny. Every outfit, every public appearance, every expression on your face was analysed and criticised. Is it any wonder that some of them drank, used drugs, found ways to escape? Here's something most people don't know. Many royal women were prescribed nerve tonics by their doctors. These tonics were supposedly for female hysteria, or neurasthenia, or various other vague conditions that basically meant being a woman is stressful. And what were in these tonics? Alcohol, opium, sometimes both. And later, when they became available, barbiturates and other sedatives. A royal woman taking her prescribed nerve tonic 3 times a day wasn't considered an addict. She was delicate. She had a sensitive constitution. She needed medical support. The fact that she was building tolerance, that she couldn't function without her tonic, that she was chemically dependent, none of that mattered, because it was doctor prescribed and socially acceptable. Compare that to how male addiction was viewed. When Edward VII gambled and visited brothels, people tutted but also kind of shrugged. Boys will be boys. When George Thorpe drank himself into oblivion, it was seen as a character flaw, but also somewhat expected of a man of his status. Male excess was problematic, but almost admired in a perverse way. It showed appetite, vitality, lack of restraint qualities that were coded as masculine, female excess that was shameful, unladylike, evidence of moral failure. A woman who drank too much wasn't just an alcoholic, she was a disgrace to her sex. A woman who used drugs wasn't struggling with addiction. She was weak, hysterical, unfit for motherhood. So royal women had to hide their addictions much more carefully than men. They took their pills in private. They had staff who were discreet. Their doctors used euphemistic language in their record. The princess requires ongoing pharmacological support for her nervous condition. Translation: she's addicted to sedatives, but we're calling it treatment. Princess Margaret's younger life shows this dynamic perfectly. In the 1950s, she fell in love with Peter Townsend, a divorced RAF officer who had served as an equerry to her father. She was in her early 20s. He was 16 years older, but by all accounts they genuinely loved each other. The problem: he was divorced. And under the Royal Marriages Act, Margaret needed the Queen's permission to marry before age 25. After that, she'd need Parliament's permission. The Church of England, of which the Queen was the head, didn't recognise remarriage after divorce. It was a mess. In 1955, after years of will they, won't they, Margaret was essentially forced to choose between the man she loved and her royal position. She chose the position. She issued a public statement saying she'd decided not to marry Peter Townsend because of the Church's teachings. But people who knew her said she was devastated. She was 25 years old and she'd just given up the great love of her life because of duty, because of rules, because of being born into a family where personal happiness came second or third or 10th after duty and tradition. So yeah, she started drinking more, smoking more, partying harder. What else was she supposed to do? She couldn't marry for love. She couldn't pursue a normal career. She couldn't escape being Princess Margaret. At least she could control what went into her body, even if that control eventually became its own form of loss of control. In 1960, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon. It was not a love match in the way Peter Townsend had been. Armstrong Jones was a photographer, charming and artistic, and Margaret seemed to think maybe she could be happy with him. They had 2 children together. But the marriage was troubled from the start. Both of them had affairs. They fought constantly. Armstrong Jones reportedly had a cruel streak. He'd make cutting remarks in public that humiliated Margaret, and Margaret, drinking more heavily, became increasingly difficult to live with. By the 1970s, their relationship was toxic, but divorce was still a huge scandal for royals. They finally separated in 1976 and divorced in 1978, the first royal divorce in centuries. Through all of this, Margaret's substance use escalated, more drinking, more pills, and allegedly based on multiple biographies and accounts from people who knew her occasional cocaine use when she was part of London's party scene. There's a tragic story that when Margaret suffered a stroke in 1998, the first of several that would eventually lead to her death in 2002, she was a heavy smoker, overweight, and had been drinking and taking pills for decades. Her body had been beaten up by years of substance use. She spent her last years partially paralyzed, suffering from depression, physically deteriorating. At her funeral in 2002, one of her friends reportedly said something like, "She was the most vibrant, alive person I ever knew. But she was trapped her whole life, and the only way she knew how to deal with it was to try to dull the pain." That's the real tragedy of Princess Margaret. Not that she used substances that's a symptom. The tragedy is that she was a bright, talented, charismatic person who was given no meaningful purpose except to be decorative and obedient. And when that wasn't enough to make life bearable, when the pressure and the loneliness and the lack of control became too much, she self-medicated. And nobody really helped her, because helping would mean admitting there was a problem, and the royal family didn't admit to problems. This pattern, women struggling with substances while the system around them denied or minimized the problem, wasn't unique to Margaret. It's been part of royal history for generations. The difference is that now, in the modern era, with its media scrutiny and its slightly more open discussions of mental health, it's harder to hide. But for most of history, female royal addiction was swept under very expensive carpets. Doctors were paid to be discreet. Staff were expected to maintain silence. And if a princess or duchess had a breakdown or needed rest, she'd be quietly sent somewhere private until she recovered, or at least until she could fake recovery well enough to resume her duties. The question that haunts me is this: how many royal women suffered in silence? How many were called difficult or hysterical when they were actually crying out for help? How many were given substances by well-meaning doctors that ultimately made everything worse? We know about Margaret because she was recent enough, public enough, documented enough. But what about all the others? The ones whose stories were successfully buried, the ones whose medicine cabinets were discreetly cleaned out before anyone could inventory what was really in there? Because here's the thing, for all the addictions we've talked about so far, the gambling, the sex, the laudanum, the food, there was a massive institutional system working to hide the extent of the problem. Doctors who were loyal first to the crown, courtiers who specialized in making scandals disappear, financial advisors who could hide money trails, and at the center of it all, an organization that had perfected the art of maintaining appearances, no matter what was happening behind closed doors. They called it the Firm, and its job was to protect the monarchy at all costs, even if that meant enabling the very addictions that were destroying it from within. The Firm. That's what the royal family calls itself behind closed doors. Not the royal family, not the monarchy, the Firm. It's a telling choice of words, isn't it? Firms make money. Firms have employees. Firms protect their brand at all costs. And that's exactly what the British monarchy has been for centuries, a carefully managed corporation where the product is prestige and any threat to that product must be neutralized. When we talk about royal addiction, we can't just talk about the individuals struggling with substances or compulsions. We have to talk about the system that enabled them, protected them, and ultimately kept their problems hidden from the public for as long as possible. Because for every royal addict, there were dozens of people whose job was to make sure the world never found out. Let me introduce you to one of the most important people you've never heard of, Sir William Knighton. In 1820, when George IV became king, he had a massive problem beyond just his mounting health issues. He had debts everywhere. Outstanding loans, unpaid gambling markers, IUs scattered across London, creditors who were getting increasingly aggressive about wanting their money back. And George, now king, couldn't just declare bankruptcy like a normal person. The King of England being dragged into debtor's court unthinkable. Enter Knighton. He was George's private secretary, but his real job was what we'd now call a fixer. His specialty making financial problems disappear. Knighton spent the 1820s engaged in what can only be described as elaborate financial wizardry. He would quietly approach creditors and negotiate settlements, usually for less than the full amount owed, with a hefty dose of, "Wouldn't it be unfortunate if His Majesty remembered your lack of discretion when it comes time to award royal patronage?" He'd buy up George's outstanding debts from gambling partners, sometimes through intermediaries, so the seller didn't even know they were dealing with the Crown. He'd shuffle money between accounts in ways that would make modern forensic accountants dizzy, and it worked. By the time George died in 1830, most of his debts had been quietly resolved. Not paid off in full, Knighton was too clever for that, but settled buried, made to go away through a combination of negotiation intimidation and creative accounting. Knighton's work was so effective that Parliament never had a full accounting of how bad George's debts actually were. To this day, historians debate the true total, because the records were deliberately obscured. Some documents were destroyed, others were filed in ways that made them nearly impossible to trace. Knighton was paid £10,000 a year, over $1 million in today's money, essentially to keep George's financial disasters from becoming public disasters. But financial fixers were just one part of the machinery. The real gatekeepers, the people who saw everything and controlled access to the most dangerous information, were the royal physicians. Being a royal doctor wasn't like being a regular doctor. Yes, you needed medical training and credentials, but you also needed something else: absolute loyalty. Royal physicians took an oath that went beyond the standard Hippocratic oath. They swore loyalty to the crown. They understood that their first duty wasn't to their patient's health, it was to the monarchy's reputation. This created some deeply problematic dynamics. When George VI was clearly addicted to laudanum, his doctors kept prescribing it. When his obesity was killing him, they suggested mild dietary changes but never insisted. Why? Because insisting would mean acknowledging the severity of the problem, and acknowledging the problem might become public. And anything public was a threat to the crown. The physicians kept meticulous records, we know this because some have survived. But those records used very careful language. Instead of writing, "The king is addicted to opiates," they'd write, "His Majesty continues to require laudanum for management of chronic pain," Zay. Instead of "The king ate himself into heart disease," it was "His Majesty experiences difficulty with ambulation due to his constitution." The records documented everything while admitting nothing, and if a royal physician did violate that trust, if they spoke publicly about what they'd seen, their career was over. Not just with the royals everywhere. The medical establishment in Britain understood that you didn't cross the firm. Dr. Thomas Vicary, who treated Henry VIII and witnessed his decline into obesity and paranoia, kept his observations extremely vague in his published works. He knew what would happen if he was too specific. This system of loyal silence extended far beyond doctors. Every staff member in a royal household signed what we'd now call non-disclosure agreements. They couldn't talk about what they saw, what they heard, or what they cleaned up. Not while employed, not after they left, not ever. The penalty for breaking silence could include lawsuits, loss of pension, and social ostracism. You'd never work in aristocratic households again. Think about what this means. When Edward VII's valets dressed him in the morning, they saw his deteriorating body. When his servants cleaned his rooms, they knew about the drinking. When his drivers took him to Le Chabanais in Paris, they knew where he was really going. And none of them could say a word. The press was another crucial piece of the machinery. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers in Britain operated under a kind of gentleman's agreement. You didn't publish certain things about royals unless the scandal was so massive you couldn't ignore it. Royal correspondents understood their access depended on maintaining good relationships with the palace. One unflattering story could mean losing access forever. When Edward VII was caught up in gambling scandals or divorce cases, the press coverage was remarkably restrained, given how juicy the details were. Yes, they reported on the trials because they were public record, but editorial comment was muted. Newspapers would describe what happened in court but rarely editorialize about what it meant for the monarchy. That wasn't journalism, that was complicity. The palace had people whose entire job was managing the press. They'd provide approved stories to keep journalists happy. They'd grant exclusive interviews to publications that had been cooperative. They'd freeze out anyone who stepped out of line. It was a carrot-and-stick system that kept most royal scandals from getting the full investigative treatment they deserved. But what happened when the problem was so severe that internal management wasn't enough, when a royal's addiction was spiralling so badly that rehab was necessary? Let me tell you about Nicholas Knatchbull. He's not as famous as the royals we've been discussing, but his story's important, because it shows how the system operates in more modern times. Nicholas was the grandson of Earl Mountbatten of Burma, who was basically royal family by association and marriage. He was also King Charles's godson, which meant he was very much part of the inner circle. In the late 1980s, Nicholas went to study at the University of Edinburgh. Within 6 months, he was expelled for drug use. Not marijuana, not casual experimentation. We're talking about hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, serious substances. His parents were devastated. The tabloids caught wind of it, which meant it couldn't be completely buried, but the palace's spin doctors went into overdrive. The story was framed as a cautionary tale about a young man who'd fallen in with the wrong crowd, not as a systemic issue within royal circles. Nicholas was sent to a private rehabilitation facility that cost £10,000 per month. £10,000. That's roughly $16,000 per month in 1990s money, probably equivalent to about $25,000 monthly today. For context, that's more than many British families earned in an entire year. And the treatment lasted for months. Who paid? The official line was Family Resources, but given the amounts involved and the Mountbatten family's financial situation at the time, there's speculation that palace funds, meaning taxpayer money, technically covered at least part of it. But we'll never know for sure because, again, the financial records aren't public. The important thing is Nicholas got help, expensive, private, discreet help that kept him out of the press as much as possible and gave him a chance to recover. And that's good. Addiction is a medical issue and people deserve treatment. But here's the uncomfortable question. How many regular British people struggling with addiction in the 1990s had access to £10,000 per month private rehab facilities? The system protected its own. If you were connected to the royal family, resources appeared. If you weren't, good luck with the NHS waitlist. Fast forward to 2002. Prince Harry, aged 17, was caught using marijuana and drinking underage at a pub near his father's estate. This could have been a massive scandal, the third in line to the throne, the son of beloved Princess Diana using illegal drugs. The tabloids were salivating, but Charles and William stepped in immediately. According to multiple accounts, William actually suggested the intervention strategy. Charles arranged for Harry to spend a day at Featherstone Lodge, a residential rehab facility in South London. Harry met with recovering heroin and cocaine addicts. He heard their stories. He saw where drug use could lead. Was it genuine concern? Absolutely. Charles was worried about his son, but it was also damage control. By proactively arranging this visit and then leaking it to the press in a controlled way, Prince Harry visits rehab to learn about dangers of drugs, the palace spun a potential disaster into a story about responsible parenting and a young prince learning an important lesson. The press coverage was largely positive. Charles takes decisive action. Harry faces consequences. What could have destroyed Harry's reputation instead became a demonstration of royal accountability. The firm's machinery adapted for the 21st century media landscape worked perfectly. But here's what most people don't know. Harry's substance use didn't stop after that 2002 intervention. Years later, in his memoir Spare, Harry revealed he'd used cocaine, marijuana and psychedelic mushrooms throughout his 20s and early 30s. The 2002 rehab visit was essentially for show, a PR move that temporarily satisfied the press without addressing the underlying issues. For years, Harry continued using substances while the palace maintained the narrative that he'd learned his lesson. Staff knew, security knew, close friends knew. But the wall of silence held because that's what the firm does, it controls the narrative. The machinery has evolved over time. In George VII's era, it was about hiding paper trails and paying off creditors. In Edward VII's time, it was about keeping affairs quiet and managing court testimony. In Margaret's era, it was about medical euphemisms and carefully managed public appearances. In Harry's era, it's about controlling media narratives and strategic leaks. But the fundamental purpose remains the same: protect the institution, even if it means enabling the individual's decline. And here's the darkest part of this system: sometimes the cover-up becomes more important than the cure. When keeping a problem secret takes priority over solving it. When maintaining appearances matters more than actual health, people suffer. They don't get the help they need when they need it, because getting help would mean admitting there's a problem, and admitting problems isn't what the firm does. Princess Margaret suffered for decades with substance issues that were minimized and hidden. How different might her life have been if instead of discreet doctors prescribing pills, she'd gotten real psychological help for her depression and trauma? If the system had prioritized her well-being over the monarchy's image, we'll never know, because the machine kept running, doing what it was designed to do: protect the crown, hide the cracks, maintain the illusion of perfect royal dignity, even when that illusion was destroying the people trapped inside it. The question is, has anything really changed? The methods are more sophisticated now. The firm uses social media strategists instead of newspaper editors. They employ crisis management consultants instead of simple fixers. But are the priorities any different? Because in the 21st century, we've seen royal addiction play out in real time. We've watched as princes and princesses struggled publicly with substances, with mental health, with the pressures of royal life. We've seen some of them try to break free from the system, to speak openly about their struggles, to ask for help in public ways that the firm never allowed before. And what happened when they did, when they broke the silence that had been maintained for centuries, when they said out loud what everyone had been pretending not to see, that's when things got really interesting. Because the modern era of royal addiction isn't just about the substances anymore. It's about the battle between transparency and tradition, between personal healing and institutional preservation, between being honest about pain and maintaining that stiff upper lip that's been the royal brand for so long. And at the centre of that battle stand the royals of this generation, the ones who grew up with therapy becoming less stigmatised with addiction, being understood as a disease rather than a moral failing, with the expectation that even public figures should be allowed to be human. They're trying to break cycles that have persisted for centuries. Some are succeeding, some are struggling, and some are caught in between trying to honour their history while not being destroyed by it. In January 2023, Prince Harry published a memoir called Spare. The title alone tells you everything. He was the spare heir, the backup, the one who didn't matter quite as much. And in that book, he did something no senior royal had ever done before he told the truth. Not the sanitised, palace-approved truth. The real uncomfortable, sometimes ugly truth about growing up royal and trying to cope with trauma through whatever means available. Here's what Harry revealed: he'd used cocaine. Not once or twice experimentally, but enough times that he knew what he was doing. He wrote about it almost casually, how it was just available at parties, how someone would offer, and he'd accept how it made him feel temporarily free from the weight of being Prince Harry. He talked about marijuana, about smoking it regularly during his 20s, about drinking, not social drinking, but drinking to numb himself, to escape, to forget for a few hours who he was and what had happened to him. And then, and this is where it gets really interesting, he talked about psychedelics, magic mushrooms specifically. He described taking them at a party at Courtney Cox's house in California. He wrote about how they made him see his bathroom trash can as a face that was speaking to him. He laughed at himself in the telling, but then he got serious. He said the psychedelics helped him process the trauma of his mother's death in ways that nothing else had. Think about that for a second. A prince third in line to the throne when he started using sixth in line, when the book came out publicly, admitting to using illegal drugs and saying they helped him. That's not just breaking the silence, that's detonating it. The reaction was predictable. Conservative media lost their minds. Commentators called him irresponsible, said he was setting a bad example, questioned whether someone with his drug history should be allowed to stay in America. Donald Trump even said during an interview that if Harry had lied on his visa application about drug use, he should face deportation. But here's what got lost in the outrage: Harry wasn't celebrating drug use. He was explaining how someone in enormous pain, someone carrying unprocessed trauma, will reach for anything that offers relief. And when you're royal, when you've been raised with the never complain, never explain doctrine when asking for help, means admitting weakness substances become the only outlet available. To understand Harry's addiction struggles, we have to understand what came before. We have to talk about his mother. Diana wasn't addicted to substances in the traditional sense, at least not that we know of, but she struggled with bulimia for years. And bulimia is addiction. It's a compulsive behaviour that provides temporary relief from emotional pain, that takes over your life, that you can't stop even when you know it's destroying you. The mechanics are the same as drug addiction, just a different substance and mechanism. Diana developed bulimia shortly after marrying Charles in 1981. She was 19 years old, suddenly thrust into the most scrutinised role imaginable, married to a man who was in love with someone else. The pressure was crushing. Food became the one thing she could control. She could decide what went in her body and when it came back out. In a life where nothing else was in her control, purging gave her a sense of power. She struggled with it throughout the 1980s. By her own account, she spoke about it in the famous 1995 BBC Panorama interview. She was binging and purging multiple times a day at her worst. Charles apparently didn't understand, dismissed it as attention-seeking. The royal family didn't really know how to handle it, so they mostly ignored it and hoped it would go away. It didn't. Diana finally got help through therapy in the early 1990s after her separation from Charles. She learned to manage the bulimia, though she admitted it never completely went away. The impulse was always there, especially during times of stress. Now imagine being Harry watching your mother struggle with something she couldn't control, seeing her be criticised and judged by the press, watching her marriage fall apart, and then when you're just 12 years old she dies in a car crash while being chased by paparazzi. 12. That's 7th grade. That's still believing your parents are basically immortal. And suddenly, your mother is gone killed by the very press that had tormented her for years, and you have to walk behind her coffin on television while millions of people watch. You have to keep it together. You have to be strong. You can't cry too much because that wouldn't be dignified. You're a prince after all. Harry has said in interviews that he couldn't cry at his mother's funeral. He felt numb, and that numbness lasted for years. He tried to process the grief on his own because asking for help, getting therapy, talking about feelings, that wasn't what royals did. So he buried it, pushed it down, tried to carry on, and then he discovered that alcohol made the pain less sharp. Marijuana made it easier to sleep without nightmares. Cocaine gave him a few hours where he could be someone else somewhere else, someone whose mother wasn't dead. I would never recommend people to do this recreationally, Harry said in an interview promoting his book. But doing it with the right people, if you are suffering from a huge amount of loss grief or trauma, then these things have a way of working as a medicine. That's the voice of someone trying to explain addiction to people who've never experienced it. He's not saying do drugs. He's saying when you're in that much pain, you'll try anything that might help, even things you know are dangerous. The palace's response to Harry's revelations was interesting. They said nothing. Officially, Buckingham Palace issued no comment on the book. That silence said everything. They couldn't defend him without acknowledging the problems were real. They couldn't condemn him without looking callous. So they just stayed quiet and hoped the story would fade. But Harry wasn't done breaking silences. In March 2021, he and his wife, Meghan, sat down with Oprah Winfrey for an interview that sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Meghan revealed that she'd been suicidal while working as a senior royal. She said she'd gone to one of the most senior people in the institution and asked for help, said she needed to go somewhere to get treatment because she was having thoughts of harming herself, and she was told no, it wouldn't be good for the institution, it would look bad, they couldn't have her going to a hospital or clinic. What would people think, so she didn't get help? She suffered in silence, or as much silence as was possible, while being hounded by tabloids and dealing with the pressures of royal life. She told Oprah that Harry was what kept her alive, that if she hadn't been pregnant she might not have made it through. Harry backed up her story. He said the family's response to Meghan's mental health crisis was what finally made him realise the institution would never change. That the same system that had failed his mother, that had failed his Aunt Margaret, that had enabled generations of royal suffering, that system was still operating the exact same way. The institution mattered more than the individual, always, every time. During the interview, Harry also talked about his own struggles with anxiety panic attacks, feeling trapped. He said there were times in his 20s when he'd be at official events and would feel like he couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in. And he couldn't leave because he had to be there, had to smile and shake hands and play his role. So he'd just push through, then go home and drink or use something calm down. That's functioning addiction. That's someone who appears fine on the outside while falling apart internally and using substances just to keep going. The family's response to the Oprah interview was swift. The Queen issued a statement saying, "The whole family is saddened, and that some recollections may vary," which was a polite way of calling Harry and Meghan liars. William reportedly was furious. Charles was hurt. The British press went into attack mode, but something interesting happened. Public opinion was split. Younger people, particularly in the UK and US, largely sided with Harry and Meghan. They saw two people trying to escape a toxic system and being punished for speaking honestly about mental health and institutional dysfunction. Older people, particularly in Britain, tended to side with the institution. You don't air dirty laundry, you maintain dignity, you keep calm and carry on. That generational divide tells you something important. Attitudes about addiction, mental health and royal duty are changing. What previous generations saw as weakness, younger generations see as honesty. What used to be shameful is now seen as brave. Harry's journey with substances didn't end with the Oprah interview. In his book and subsequent interviews, he talked about working with therapists about doing EMDR therapy for PTSD, about specifically using psychedelics in a therapeutic context, not at parties, but with trained facilitators helping him process trauma. This is controversial, right? Psychedelic therapy is gaining acceptance in medical communities. There are legitimate studies showing psilocybin and MDMA can help with PTSD and depression when used properly, but it's still illegal in most places, and for a prince to publicly endorse it, that's wild. Harry described sessions where mushrooms helped him access memories and feelings he'd been blocking for 25 years. He talked about finally being able to cry about his mother's death, something he couldn't do at her funeral. He said the experience was transformative, that it helped him understand himself and his trauma in ways that years of traditional talk therapy hadn't. Now we should be clear, this doesn't mean psychedelics are a magic cure for addiction or trauma. They can be dangerous if misused. Harry was careful to say he did this with professional guidance, not just randomly taking drugs. But the fact that he's talking about it publicly, framing certain substances as potentially therapeutic, rather than just recreational or harmful, that's a massive shift from how royals have historically discussed these issues. Compare Harry's openness to how previous generations handled similar problems. George III's laudanum addiction was hidden behind medical language. Edward VII's excesses were minimised as high spirits. Margaret's pills were her nerve condition. The pattern was always the same: hide it, minimise it, never admit there's a real problem. Harry said, "I had a problem. I used substances to cope with trauma. It almost destroyed me. Here's how I got help." That's revolutionary for a royal, but here's the hard truth: speaking openly came at a cost. Harry and Meghan lost their royal titles. Technically, they kept them, but can't use them professionally. They were cut off financially from the family. They moved to California, essentially going into exile. Harry's relationship with William is reportedly still fractured. His relationship with Charles is strained. Was it worth it? Harry seems to think so. He said in interviews that leaving the institution probably saved his life, or at least saved him from becoming another royal casualty of the system. He can get therapy now without worrying about palace approval. He can talk about his struggles without a press office controlling the narrative. He can, for the first time in his life, prioritize his mental health over institutional appearance. But it's hard. You can hear it in his interviews, see it in how he talks about his family. He didn't want to leave. He wanted the institution to change, to modernize, to prioritize people over protocol. When that didn't happen, he felt he had no choice. That's the tragedy of modern royal addiction struggles. The individuals are finally willing to be honest to get help to break generational patterns, but the institution hasn't caught up. The firm still operates on the same principles it did in George III's time: protect the monarchy, maintain appearances, never admit weakness. Something has to give. Either the institution adapts, starts treating mental health and addiction as medical issues, rather than PR problems, starts prioritizing individual well-being over institutional image, or we'll keep seeing royals either suffer in silence or leave entirely. Harry chose to leave, but he's not the only one struggling with these issues. We know from various reports that other young royals have dealt with anxiety, depression, and the pressure of public life. They're just dealing with it more quietly, trying to work within the system rather than against it. Will they succeed? Can you really reform an institution from the inside when that institution has been operating the same way for centuries? When the whole point of the monarchy is tradition and continuity, can you suddenly prioritize change and individual well-being? I don't know. But I do know the question itself would have been unthinkable 50 years ago. The fact that we're even discussing royal mental health and addiction openly, that we're questioning whether the institution should change, that's progress, even if it's slow and painful. Because underneath all the history we've covered, the gambling, the laudanum, the affairs, the cover-up, there's a simpler truth. These are people, flawed, struggling human people, who happen to have been born into a system that's often worked against their well-being rather than for it. Some of them have enabled others, some have profited from others' addictions, and some have just been trying to survive. But behind every addiction story there are other people too. The ones who made money from royal excess, the merchants and dealers and enablers who saw opportunity and vulnerability, the ones who fed the beast because the beast paid well. Every addiction needs a supplier. Behind every royal excess, there were people making money, lots of money, from keeping those excesses flowing. And here's the uncomfortable truth: many of them were respectable business people, pillars of society, people who attended church on Sunday and counted royals among their most valued clients, Monday through Saturday. Let me tell you about the royal warrant system. If you've ever seen products with "by appointment to Her Majesty" on the label, that's a royal warrant. It's basically an official endorsement from the monarchy saying we use this company's products. It's supposed to be an honour, a mark of quality, and for businesses it's worth its weight in gold because it signals prestige and guarantees customers. But throughout history, some of those royal warrants went to companies that were essentially enabling royal addiction. Take John Bell and Croydon, a pharmacy that received its first royal warrant in 1798. They supplied medications to the royal household for over 2 centuries. Now they were a legitimate pharmacy. They still exist today in London. But in the 1800s, they were one of the primary suppliers of laudanum to the palace. They knew exactly what they were sending and how much. When Queen Victoria's household ordered larger and larger quantities of opiate-based medicines over the years, John Bell and Croydon filled those orders without question. Why would they question it? The royals were their best customers. One royal warrant meant prestige, but it also meant guaranteed income. You don't ask your wealthiest client if maybe they're ordering too much addictive medication. You fill the order, send the bill, and maintain discretion. There were multiple pharmacies competing for royal business. Savory and Moore, another London pharmacy, also held royal warrants. They advertised their royal patronage heavily. It was their main selling point. We supply Her Majesty's household, translated to ordinary customers as, if it's good enough for the Queen, it's good enough for you. The irony: some of what they were supplying to Her Majesty's household was fueling dependencies that were slowly destroying the people they served. But the pharmaceutical suppliers were just the beginning. The real money was in luxury goods. Asprey, the legendary luxury goods company on New Bond Street, received its first royal warrant from Queen Victoria in 1862. They sold everything: jewellery, silverware, leather goods, objets d'art. And they supplied the royal family with gifts for mistresses. Edward VII was one of their best customers. When he needed a gift for Lily Langtry or Alice Keppel, and he needed gifts often to keep his mistresses happy, he'd send someone to Asprey. They'd select something appropriately expensive and appropriately discreet: a bracelet, a jewelled cigarette case, items that showed affection and taste but weren't so ostentatious they'd create scandal. Asprey kept meticulous records of these purchases, but those records were private. Part of their service was discretion. They knew which items were going to which women, but they'd never tell. That discretion was worth paying for, and Edward paid well. Gerard, the Crown Jewellers, had a similar relationship with the royals. They've held a royal warrant since 1735. They made crown jewels, yes, but they also made gifts for royal mistresses and items that royals used to pay off debts or gamble with. Jewellery was essentially currency for royals, portable, valuable, easily given away or sold. When George VIII needed to liquidate assets to pay gambling debts, Gerard would quietly buy back items they'd previously sold to him, no questions asked. They'd value the pieces conservatively so George wouldn't get full value, but they'd be discreet about the transaction. That discretion cost George money, but it saved his reputation. Now let's talk about the wine and spirit suppliers. Berry Brothers and Rudd wine merchants on St James's Street received their first royal warrant in 1760s. They've supplied wine to every monarch since George III. Their cellars are legendary. They also kept detailed accounts of exactly how much each royal household was ordering. When Edward VII's wine orders started increasing, and we're talking about cases upon cases of champagne brandy, Port Berry Brothers knew they were supplying someone with a serious drinking habit. The quantities weren't for entertaining alone. They were for daily consumption. Did they say anything? Of course not. They were running a business, and royals paid their bills usually. Having "by appointment to His Majesty" on their storefront meant every wealthy person in London wanted to buy their wine. Royal alcoholism was frankly good for business. The gambling establishments were perhaps the most cynical enablers of all. White's Club, Brooks's, Boodle's, these exclusive gentlemen's clubs in St James's, weren't just social venues. They were essentially legalised casinos for the aristocracy. The owners and managers of these clubs made fortunes from members like George Thor and Charles James Fox, who couldn't stop gambling. They'd extend credit, allow debts to accumulate, knowing that eventually the money would come either from family, from Parliament, or from selling off assets. White's betting book, which recorded all the wagers made at the club, was supposed to be a quirky record of gentlemanly wagering. But reading it now, it's really a ledger of addiction. The same names appear over and over, betting absurd amounts on ridiculous things. The club made money from the house cut of each bet from membership fees and from the interest they charged on credit extended to gambling addicts who couldn't pay their immediate debts. The club managers knew exactly what they were doing. They'd sometimes even stage events or create betting opportunities specifically designed to keep the big gamblers engaged. A visiting celebrity, let's have bets on what they'll wear. An upcoming election, create a whole betting pool around it. Keep the action going, keep the money flowing, and if someone went completely broke and lost everything, well, that's unfortunate, but it made room for a new wealthy member to take their place. The club continued. The addiction economy rolled on. But perhaps the most complicated enablers were the mistresses themselves. We've talked about them as victims of a system, and many were, but some of them were also savvy economic actors who understood exactly how to profit from royal addiction to pleasure. Take Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick. During her 9-year affair with Edward VII, she accumulated significant wealth, not just from direct gifts, but from strategic positioning. Edward would introduce her to businessmen and politicians. Those introductions had value. People wanted access to the Prince of Wales, and Daisy was the gatekeeper. She leveraged that access. Businessmen would invest in her interests, giving her shares in companies, helping her husband secure profitable positions in exchange for introductions to Edward. It was a whole economy built around the prince's sexual addiction. And when the affair ended, Daisy tried to blackmail Edward. She had his letters, intimate, indiscreet letters, and she threatened to publish them unless he paid her off. Edward, now king, had to use intermediaries to negotiate with her. Eventually the letters were secured, but it cost the crown a significant sum. Daisy turned her affair into a lifelong income stream. Or look at Lily Langtry, who we mentioned earlier. Yes, Edward helped launch her acting career, but Lily was nobody's fool. She parlayed her relationship with the prince into a celebrity that lasted long after their affair ended. She became one of the first modern celebrities famous for being famous, essentially. She made money from endorsements, from appearance fees, from having her image on products. She turned Edward's sexual addiction into her personal brand. Now I'm not condemning these women. They were operating in a system that gave them few options and even fewer protections. If Edward was going to use them for his pleasure, they might as well profit from it. But we should acknowledge that royal addiction created an entire ecosystem where everyone from the mistresses to the club managers to the wine merchants had a financial incentive to keep the addiction going. Here's a specific example that shows how this worked. When George IV was Prince of Wales, he bought a property in Brighton that he transformed into the Royal Pavilion, that wild Indo-Gothic palace that still stands today. The renovation cost was astronomical. Initial estimates said about $500,000, that's £60 million today. It ended up costing much more. Who did the work? Hundreds of artisans, designers, builders. They all had a vested interest in George's spending addiction continuing because it paid their wages. The more excessive George's tastes, the more elaborate the designs, the more money they made. Frederick Crace, the interior designer, basically had a blank check. George would say, I want the walls covered in gold leaf and the ceiling painted to look like palm trees, and Crace would say, absolutely, Your Royal Highness, excellent taste, and not mention that it would cost another £20,000. Was Crace enabling George's compulsive spending? Absolutely. Was he also just running his business and feeding his own family? Also, yes. That's the complexity of the enabler economy. Most of these people weren't evil. They were just responding to economic incentives that made royal addiction profitable. The fashion industry operated the same way. George Beau Brummel, the famous dandy and style setter, was Edward VII's close friend and fashion advisor. Brummel would take Edward and other wealthy men shopping, encouraging them to buy multiple versions of the same outfit in different fabrics, to change clothes several times a day to always have the latest style. Brummel made commission from tailors like Schweitzer and Davidson on Savile Row, from bootmakers like Hobie, from hatters like Lock & Co. All of these establishments held royal warrants. All of them profited from royal shopping addiction. Edward VII reportedly owned hundreds of suits. Hundreds. He'd wear an outfit once or twice, then never wear it again. The tailors loved this because it meant constant orders. They'd send representatives to the palace regularly to take new measurements, show new fabrics, suggest new styles. They were feeding a shopping compulsion, but they called it maintaining His Majesty's wardrobe. Lock & Cumber, the hatters, who still operate on St. James's Street, kept records showing Edward ordered dozens of new hats every season. Did anyone say, "Sir, you already have 40 hats, perhaps that's enough"? Never. Each new hat was another sale, another commission. another reason to maintain the royal warrant. Now let's talk about the moneylenders, because when royals ran out of ready cash, which happened often, they needed credit. Banks didn't want to lend to royals because the amounts were huge and collection was complicated. You can't exactly repossess from a prince. So specialist moneylenders filled the gap. They'd offer loans at high interest rates, sometimes 20 or 30%, knowing the risk was worth it. If the royal paid, they made a fortune. If the royal defaulted, they'd negotiate for something else of value, property, influence, appointments. These weren't shady back-alley loan sharks. They were established financial firms with offices in Mayfair. They wore expensive suits and spoke in refined accents. But they were making money from royal financial desperation, from gambling debts and spending addictions that had spiraled out of control. One firm, Coutts & Cummers Bank, which still exists as the royal family's bank, made significant profits from managing royal accounts, but also from the fees they charged when overdrafts occurred, which was often. They'd cover the shortfall, charge interest and fees, and add it to the running tab. They had every incentive to let royals overspend because it was profitable. The really insidious part. Many of these enablers maintained plausible deniability. The pharmacist could say, "I'm just filling prescriptions from royal physicians." The wine merchant could say, "I'm just supplying what's ordered." The tailor could say, "I'm just meeting the standards expected of royal attire." The gambling club could say, "We're simply providing a venue for gentlemen's entertainment." None of them had to acknowledge they were profiting from addiction. They could maintain the fiction that they were simply providing services to valued customers who happened to be royal. This system still exists today, by the way. It's more sophisticated, more hidden, but the dynamics are similar. There are still luxury goods companies, still discretion specialists, still financial advisors who help wealthy people, including royals, spend money in ways that might not be entirely healthy. The difference now is that we're more aware of addiction, more willing to call it what it is. When previous generations saw a prince buying his 20th car or 100th suit, they called it royal prerogative. Now we might recognize it as compulsive shopping. When we see someone needing daily medicine from the same pharmacy, we ask questions about dependency. But the economic incentives haven't changed. There's still money to be made from excess, from compulsion, from people using money or substances or experiences to fill voids that can't really be filled that way. The question is, who bears responsibility? The addict who consumes, or the suppliers who profit, the royal who gambles away a fortune, or the club that extends unlimited credit? It's easy to judge the individuals, to say George IV should have controlled himself, Edward VII should have been faithful, Margaret should have sought proper help. But what about the systems that made their addictions profitable for so many people? What about the economic structures that turned royal pain into other people's profit? Because here's the really uncomfortable truth. Royal addiction wasn't just tolerated, it was economically necessary. Whole industries depended on it. Jobs depended on it. Businesses rose and fell based on royal patronage, which often meant catering to royal compulsions. And that raises an even bigger question. If addiction can become so embedded in economic systems that multiple industries depend on it continuing, how do you ever break the cycle? How do you help someone get clean when their addiction is literally funding other people's livelihoods? These aren't just historical questions. They're relevant today, not just for royals, but for anyone struggling with addiction, while surrounded by people who profit directly or indirectly from keeping them sick. There's a photograph from the early 1900s showing 4 generations of British royals together: Queen Victoria, her son Edward VII, her grandson George V, and her great-grandson Edward VIII, who would later abdicate. 4 generations. 4 men. And if you knew their stories, you'd see addiction patterns woven through each one like a genetic marker. Victoria used laudanum daily. Edward VII was addicted to pleasure in all its forms. George V, trying to be different from his father, became rigidly controlled, which is its own kind of compulsion. And Edward VIII, he'd become so addicted to Wallis Simpson that he'd give up the throne for her. 4 generations, 4 different manifestations of the same underlying issue, and inability to regulate, to find balance, to simply be okay. This isn't coincidence. This is pattern. And patterns run deep in royal bloodlines. Let's start with something we can actually trace genetically: haemophilia. Victoria carried the gene and passed it to several of her children, who then spread it through European royal families. It became known as the royal disease. By the early 20th century, haemophilia had affected the Spanish, German and Russian royal families, all because of one carrier, Victoria. Now, addiction doesn't work exactly like haemophilia. There's no single gene that makes you an addict, but there is genetic predisposition. Modern research suggests that about 50% of addiction vulnerability is genetic. If your parents struggled with addiction, you're significantly more likely to struggle as well, not guaranteed, but the risk is higher. Combine genetic predisposition with environment and you get a perfect storm. Royal children didn't just potentially inherit genes that made them more vulnerable to addiction. They also grew up watching their parents use substances to cope with stress. Saw excess, modelled as normal, learned that when life gets hard, you reach for something external to fix it. George III had 15 children. 15. And many of them struggled with issues that we'd now recognise as addiction or mental health problems. His eldest son, George IV, we've discussed his gambling and drinking. But what about the others, Prince Frederick, Duke of York? George III's second son was a heavy drinker and gambler. He accumulated massive debts, not as much as his older brother, but significant enough that he had to be bailed out multiple times. He also had a mistress, Mary Ann Clark, who was caught selling military commissions and promotions. Frederick's addiction to both women and gambling made him vulnerable to that scandal. Prince William Henry, Duke of Clarence, later King William IV, had 10 illegitimate children with an actress named Dorothea Jordan. 10. Over 20 years. He was faithful to her in his way, but the compulsive nature of their relationship and his later bizarre behaviour as king suggests someone who didn't quite know how to regulate himself. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, was rumoured to have such a violent temper and such strange behaviours that people suspected him of murder. His valet was found with his throat cut in 1810. Was Ernest responsible? Probably not. The investigation concluded it was suicide, but the fact that people believed he could have done it tells you something about his reputation for uncontrolled rage. And then there was Princess Amelia, George III's youngest daughter. She died at 27, possibly of tuberculosis, but also after years of what was described as melancholia, what we'd now call depression. She was reportedly given laudanum for pain, and by the end she was taking large doses regularly. So out of George III's 15 children, several showed signs of addictive or compulsive behaviour. Coincidence or pattern? Now, George III himself had his own issues. We talked about his madness and possible porphyria, but there's another angle to consider. George III's symptoms, the episodes of mania, aggression, confusion, they appeared sporadically throughout his life. Modern researchers have suggested that some of his symptoms might have been withdrawal from medications his doctors prescribed, particularly opium-based ones. Think about the cycle. George has an episode. Doctors give him opium to calm him. He becomes dependent. When they try to reduce the dose, he has withdrawal symptoms that look like his illness returning, so they give him more. The illness and the treatment became impossible to separate, and his children watched this. They saw their father restrained during episodes. They saw doctors constantly hovering with medications. They learned that when someone in the royal family struggles, you medicate. You don't talk about feelings. You don't address underlying causes. You dose them with something that makes the problem less visible. Is it any wonder they grew up to medicate themselves? But here's where it gets really interesting from a genetic standpoint. Victoria wasn't George III's direct descendant. She was his granddaughter through a different son, Edward, Duke of Kent. So when we see addiction patterns in Victoria's line, we're seeing them persist across a slightly different genetic branch. Victoria's 9 children spread across Europe through marriage. They called her the grandmother of Europe. And through those marriages, we can trace not just haemophilia, but behavioural patterns. Her eldest son, Edward VII, we've covered his issues extensively. But what about the others? Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, was an alcoholic. This wasn't hidden. People who knew him commented on his heavy drinking. He died at 55, probably from throat cancer, likely related to his drinking and smoking. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, had haemophilia and was given morphine regularly for pain. By the end of his short life, he died at 30 after a fall. He was dependent on it. His daughter, Princess Alice, later struggled with what was called nervous disorders and spent time in sanitariums. Princess Alice, Victoria's second daughter, died young, but several of her children had issues. Her son Ernest had mental health problems. Her daughter Alex became the last Tsarina of Russia, and while she didn't have obvious addictions, she fell under the influence of Rasputin, partly because he seemed able to help her haemophiliac son. She was desperate for any solution, any escape from the fear of her child dying. Victoria's daughter, Beatrice, reportedly used laudanum like her mother. It was just accepted, mother did it, so I do it too. The pattern isn't exact in each generation. Addiction doesn't work that way. But the vulnerability is they're passed down through genetics and learned behaviour. Now let's talk about Edward VII's children, because this is where things get really sad. Edward VII had 6 children with Alexandra, though one died in infancy. His eldest son, Albert Victor, known as Eddie, was by all accounts a disaster. He was reportedly slow, possibly intellectually disabled, definitely irresponsible. There were rumours about gambling, about visiting brothels, about all manner of scandals. The Cleveland Street scandal of 1889 involved a male brothel, and Eddie's name was connected to it, though whether he was actually involved or just rumoured to be involved is still debated. What's clear is that Eddie showed the same patterns as his father, seeking pleasure, compulsively, unable to self-regulate, getting into situations that embarrassed the family. Eddie died in 1892 at 28 from influenza. Some historians have suggested it was a relief to the royal family because he was so troubled. His younger brother George, more stable, more controlled, became heir instead, and eventually King George I. George I was interesting. He saw his father's excesses and his brother's failures, and he went the opposite direction. He became almost pathologically controlled. Rigid routines, strict discipline, everything in its place. Some historians suggest this was its own form of compulsion, an eating disorder in reverse, if you will, instead of excess pathological restraint. And George V's children, the pattern continues. Edward V, who abdicated for Wallis Simpson, that wasn't just romance, that was obsession. By all accounts, Edward was completely consumed by his relationship with Wallis, to the point where nothing else mattered. Not duty, not family, not the crown. That's addiction to a relationship, and it has the same neurobiology as addiction to substances. His brother George VI, who became king after the abdication, was a heavy smoker. Chain smoked. He died at 56 from lung cancer and coronary thrombosis, both directly related to smoking. He couldn't quit despite doctors telling him it was killing him. That's nicotine addiction, pure and simple. And George VI's daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. Elizabeth seems to have escaped the worst of the family patterns, though she drinks daily and has a famous love of gin and Dubonnet. Margaret, as we've discussed, struggled with cigarettes, alcohol, and possibly other substances. So we have George III's troubled children, Victoria's medicated children, Edward VII's excessive children, George V's controlled, obsessive children, Edward VI's obsessive relationship, George V's smoking, Margaret's multiple dependencies. 7 generations. The specific addiction changes, but the pattern of using something external to cope with internal pain that remains constant. Modern addiction research explains why this happens. It's not just that genes are passed down, though that's part of it. It's also epigenetics, how trauma and stress can actually change how genes are expressed, and those changes can be passed to the next generation. If your grandmother experienced severe trauma, say losing a husband young like Victoria did, that stress can actually affect how certain genes function. Those changes can be inherited. Your vulnerability to anxiety, depression, addiction, that can be partly biological inheritance of your grandmother's trauma. It's wild when you think about it. Victoria's grief over Albert's death in 1861 might have literally changed her DNA in ways that affected her children and grandchildren's vulnerability to mental health issues and addiction. On top of the genetics, there's learned behaviour. Children learn how to cope by watching their parents. If you grow up in a household where stress is managed with substances, where emotions are medicated away rather than processed, where problems are hidden rather than addressed, you learn that's how life works. Princess Diana's family, the Spencers, had their own patterns of mental health struggles. Diana's father was reportedly alcoholic. Her mother was said to be emotionally cold. Diana herself struggled with bulimia depression and likely undiagnosed complex PTSD from childhood trauma. She passed some of that vulnerability to her sons, not because she was a bad mother, but because trauma affects parenting, and children internalize their parents' pain. Harry has spoken about this in therapy. He's talked about how his mother's unprocessed trauma affected him, how he internalized her pain without understanding what he was carrying. That's intergenerational trauma in action. William seems more controlled, more like his grandmother Elizabeth, managing through rigid structure and duty. But that's also a way of coping, potentially its own form of compulsion. We won't know for decades if that control is healthy self-discipline, or if it's a different manifestation of the same underlying inability to simply feel and process difficult emotions. The question is, can the cycle be broken? The research says yes, but it requires conscious effort. It requires recognizing the patterns, getting therapy, learning new coping mechanisms, sometimes medication the right kind, properly managed and deliberately choosing not to pass the trauma down. Harry seems to be trying. He's been public about therapy about EMDR for PTSD, about working to process trauma so he doesn't pass it to his children. He's talked about breaking the cycle of genetic pain, his words, so his kids grow up healthier than he did. Will it work? Time will tell. Breaking generational patterns is incredibly hard, especially when those patterns are centuries old and embedded in everything from genetics to family culture to institutional expectations. But at least he's trying. At least he's looking at the pattern and saying, this ends with me. That's more than most of his ancestors ever did, because for most of royal history nobody even acknowledged there was a pattern. Each generation's struggles were treated as individual failings rather than part of a larger cycle. George VI was just weak-willed. Edward VII was just oversexed. Margaret was just unstable. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody said, maybe this is a family disease that needs family-level intervention. And without that recognition, the pattern just repeated. Each generation found new ways to manifest the same old pain. New substances, new compulsions, new ways to avoid feeling what needed to be felt. The tragedy is that so much of this could have been prevented. Not all of it. Some genetic vulnerabilities are real and would exist regardless. But the learned behaviours, the passed down trauma, the modelling of unhealthy coping, that could have been interrupted at any point if someone had been willing to break the silence and address the pattern. Instead, generation after generation chose loyalty to the institution over individual well-being, chose maintaining appearances over getting help, chose passing the pain down rather than processing it themselves, and the cost of those choices measured in shortened lives, damaged relationships, potential, squandered suffering endured. That cost is incalculable, not just for the royals themselves, but for everyone affected by their decisions made, while struggling with unaddressed addiction and unprocessed trauma. Because these weren't just personal struggles. These were struggles of people with power, people whose pain affected policies, started wars, shaped history. When a king makes decisions while addicted to opiates or obsessed with a mistress or desperate for gambling money, those decisions affect millions. So as we near the end of this journey through centuries of royal addiction, we have to ask, what's the final accounting? What did all this excess, all this enabling, all this generational pain actually cost? Not just in money or prestige, but in human terms, in lives affected, in potential, unrealized, in suffering that could have been prevented. And more importantly, has anything really changed? Or are we still watching the same patterns play out just with better PR and more sophisticated ways of hiding the damage? So here we are at the end of this long journey through centuries of royal excess. We've met gambling addicts who lost kingdoms at card tables, drug users who built empires on opium, sex addicts who commissioned custom furniture. And through it all, we've seen a system that enabled, profited from, and ultimately tried to hide the human cost of unlimited privilege combined with unlimited access. But we haven't yet answered the most important question: what did it all actually cost? Let's start with the most obvious cost: money. Just money. If you could add up all the gambling debts, the wasted spending, the bailouts, the money paid to keep scams quiet, the economic losses from impaired decision-making, what would the total be? George IV alone cost the British Treasury millions upon millions in today's money. His debts, his renovations, his coronation, his lifestyle. One estimate suggests that over his lifetime, George cost the equivalent of over £100 million in modern money for one person. One prince then king who contributed relatively little to governance because he was too busy drinking, gambling and renovating palaces. The Opium Wars fought essentially to protect Britain's drug trafficking operation. Cost money, yes, but more importantly they cost lives. Tens of thousands died in those wars. Millions of Chinese became addicted to opium. The social and economic devastation in China lasted for generations, and all of it can be traced back to the British Empire's need for revenue that was partly funding royal excess and partly funding the empire's own addiction to expansion and wealth. Here's something most history books don't connect to the money Britain made from opium sales in the 1800s, that 15 to 20% of colonial India's revenue we mentioned. Some of that money went directly to the civil list, which funded the royal household. Victoria's morning laudanum was essentially paid for by Chinese opium addicts. The system was circular: sell opium to China, use the profits to fund the empire, and the royals use opium themselves. It's darkly poetic. But the economic cost is just the beginning. What about the political cost in 1811, when George III's final mental breakdown meant George IV had to become Prince Regent? Britain was in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. These were crucial years. Decisions about military strategy, about alliances, about how to handle Napoleon, these were being made while the Prince Regent was heavily using laudanum and dealing with his various addictions. Did George IV's impairment affect those decisions? We'll never know for certain. But we do know that he was erratic, that his mood swings were famous, that people learned to approach him at certain times of day when he was more lucid. That's not ideal for someone who needs to make decisions about war and peace. Edward VII's reign from 1901 to 1910 was relatively short but historically significant. This was the period when tensions were building in Europe, when alliances were forming that would eventually lead to World War I. Edward was called the Uncle of Europe because he was related to so many European monarchs. He was in a unique position to influence diplomatic relations. But Edward was distracted. He spent huge amounts of time with his mistresses at parties, gambling, eating elaborate meals. The Kaiser of Germany, Edward's nephew, reportedly complained that you couldn't have serious political discussions with Edward because he was always surrounded by racehorses and actresses. When Edward died in 1910, Germany and Britain were already on a collision course toward war. Could Edward have done more to prevent World War I if he'd been more focused on diplomacy and less focused on pleasure? Historians debate this. But the fact that we can even ask the question tells you something about the cost of royal distraction. George VI, Elizabeth II's father, was a heavy smoker, as we've mentioned. He died in 1952 at age 56, much younger than he should have. His daughter Elizabeth became queen at 25, younger than planned. She had less preparation time, less mentorship from her father than she would have had if he'd lived to a normal lifespan. Elizabeth's early years as queen were marked by her inexperience. She made mistakes, relied heavily on advisors, struggled with some aspects of the role. Would she have been better prepared if her father had lived another 10 or 15 years? Almost certainly. His smoking addiction literally changed the course of her reign in British history. Then there's the cost to the institution itself. Each scandal, each revelation of excess or addiction chips away at public support for the monarchy. In the 1990s, after all the divorces and scandals, Charles and Diana Andrew and Fergie Ann's divorce public support for the monarchy hit historic lows. Polls showed that significant percentages of British people thought the monarchy should be abolished. The scandals weren't all about addiction, but many were connected to it. Charles's affair with Camilla, while married to Diana Andrews' associations with Jeffrey Epstein. The general sense that royals were living excessively, while ordinary people struggled. All of this damaged the monarchy's reputation and legitimacy. After the Oprah interview with Harry and Meghan in 2021, polls showed that support for the monarchy among young people in Britain was barely above 50%. In Commonwealth countries like Australia and Jamaica, there are serious discussions about removing the British monarch as head of state. The institution that has survived for over 1,000 years is facing an existential crisis. How much of that crisis stems from addiction and the cover-ups around it? It's impossible to quantify precisely, but the pattern is clear each time the public learns about royal excess, royal suffering that was hidden, royal addiction that was enabled. Trust erodes a little more. There's also a cost we haven't talked much about: the cost of opportunities not taken. What could these people have accomplished if they hadn't been struggling with addiction? Edward VII was actually quite intelligent and charismatic when he wanted to be. His diplomatic skills helped ease tensions between Britain and France. The Entente Cordiale of 1904 owed a lot to Edward's personal charm during a state visit to Paris. Imagine if he'd applied that energy and skill consistently instead of spending half his time at brothels and gambling clubs. What might he have accomplished? Princess Margaret was reportedly very talented, artistic, musical, witty. But she spent her life being the spare, drinking too much, taking pills, struggling with depression. What could she have created or contributed if she'd gotten real help for her trauma, instead of being told to put on a sweater and cope? Harry seems bright, empathetic, good with people. He did meaningful work with his Invictus games for wounded veterans. But for years he was self-medicating, struggling unable to fully engage with life. Now that he's gotten help and speaks openly about it, he's become an advocate for mental health. Imagine if he'd gotten that help at 20 instead of 35. How much more could he have done? Multiply that across centuries of the royals, and the lost potential is staggering. How many innovations never happened because a royal was too impaired to patronize the right scientist? How many diplomatic opportunities were missed because a king was too drunk or high to pay attention? How many artistic or cultural contributions never materialized because talented people were trapped in gilded cages medicating their pain instead of processing it? But here's something interesting: the scandals and struggles have also forced positive change. George III's financial disasters led to much stricter parliamentary oversight of royal spending. No monarch since has been able to accumulate that level of personal debt. The scandals of the 1990s led to the royal family paying taxes for the first time in modern history. In 1992, that annus horribilis, the Queen, agreed to pay income tax on her private income. It was a concession to public pressure and acknowledgement that the old rules weren't sustainable. The more recent openness about mental health, partly forced by Harry and Meghan's revelations, has led to the royal family becoming more vocal about mental health advocacy. William, Kate and Harry launched the Heads Together campaign in 2016 to reduce stigma around mental health issues. The palace now acknowledges that mental health struggles are real, that seeking help is important, that the old stiff upper lip approach was damaging. These changes wouldn't have happened without the scandals, without the public pressure, without people like Harry breaking the silence. Sometimes institutions only change when they're forced to, when the cost of not changing becomes too high. So what's the lesson in all of this? What do we take away from this long, strange, sometimes heartbreaking journey through centuries of royal addiction? First, addiction is human. It doesn't care about your title, your wealth, your breeding. If anything, having unlimited resources and unlimited pressure creates the perfect conditions for addiction to flourish. The royals weren't addicts because they were morally weak or bad people. They were addicts because they were human beings in impossible situations using the tools available to them to cope. Second, systems matter. The royal family's institutional approach: never complain, never explain, hide problems, protect the image above all else, that system enabled and prolonged addiction rather than addressing it. The doctors who prescribed without questioning, the suppliers who profited without concern, the staff who maintained silence, the press that looked away. They all created an environment where addiction could thrive unchecked. Third, breaking cycles is possible, but requires courage. Harry's decision to speak openly, to get therapy, to use his platform to advocate for mental health, that took immense courage. He gave up his royal position, his financial security, his relationship with much of his family. But he also potentially broke a cycle that had persisted for 7 generations. His children might grow up healthier because he was willing to be honest about pain. Fourth, privilege doesn't protect you from suffering. If anything, it can make suffering worse because you're expected to be grateful, to not complain, to appreciate your advantages. But you can have everything and still be in pain. You can live in a palace and still be trapped. Wealth and status don't cure addiction or trauma. Sometimes they just provide more expensive ways to avoid dealing with it. And finally, transparency is better than secrecy. For centuries, the royal family kept its struggles hidden, and that secrecy hurt everyone involved. The addicts suffered alone. The public was deceived. The problems festered and grew worse. Now, slowly, painfully, there's more openness, more acknowledgement that these are medical issues, not moral failures, more willingness to get help and speak honestly. It's not perfect. The institution still resists change. There's still plenty of cover-up and spin. But compared to even 50 years ago, the shift is significant. And that shift happened because people refused to stay silent because the old way became unsustainable, because the cost of secrecy finally exceeded the cost of honesty. So here we are in 2025. The British monarchy still exists, still struggles with its legacy, still grapples with how to balance tradition and modernity, duty and well-being, institutional preservation and individual health. Some royals are trying to break the old patterns. Others are still caught in them, still managing their struggles privately, still maintaining that famous British reserve. The institution itself is slowly, reluctantly adapting, acknowledging mental health, being slightly more transparent, accepting that the old rules don't work in the modern world. Will the monarchy survive another century? That depends partly on whether it can fully evolve beyond the patterns we've explored tonight, Whether it can prioritize people over image health, over tradition, honesty over appearance, whether it can acknowledge its complicated history without being destroyed by that acknowledgement. The story of royal addiction is ultimately a story about the human condition, our vulnerability to pain, our desperate search for relief, our capacity for both tremendous resilience and tremendous self-destruction. The royals had more resources than most people, but they weren't immune to human frailty. In some ways, their struggles illuminate our own. We all face pressure trauma pain. We all look for ways to cope. The question is whether we find healthy ways, or whether we turn to things that ultimately make it worse. The royal story teaches us that no amount of wealth or power can substitute for genuine mental health support, for honest relationships, for the freedom to be vulnerable. It teaches us that systems can enable suffering as easily as they can prevent it. And it teaches us that change, while difficult,